Polar bear attacks. Scientists at Arctic Station, December 3, 2025. The Arctic wind howled across the endless expanse of white that stretched beyond the horizon, carrying with it the scent of ancient ice and the promise of death. At 71 degrees north latitude, the Beaufort Sea Research Station stood like a defiant speck of human civilization against the vast wilderness of Alaska's North Slope, 37 miles northeast of Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow. The station, officially designated as Arctic Research Facility Delta 7, had been operational for 18 months, serving as a critical outpost for climate researchers studying the rapidly changing polar environment. Dr. Rachel Marie Stein pressed her mittened hand against the triple-paned window of the main laboratory, watching the polar twilight paint the landscape in shades of blue and purple that seemed to shift and breathe with each gust of wind. At 39 years old, she had dedicated the last 15 years of her life to understanding the complex ecosystems of the Arctic, earning her doctorate in marine biology from Stanford University before completing postdoctoral research at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Her specialty was the study of phytoplankton populations and their response to changing ice conditions, work that had brought her to this remote outpost for the third time in her career. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall, with auburn hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail, Rachel had the lean build of someone who spent more time hiking across frozen landscapes than sitting in lecture halls. Her green eyes held the intensity of a scientist who had witnessed firsthand the dramatic changes occurring in the Arctic environment, changes that kept her awake at night long after her colleagues had retired to their bunks. She had arrived at the station on November 15th, along with a team of 7 other researchers for what was planned to be a 6-week intensive study of winter marine conditions. The station itself was a marvel of Arctic engineering, consisting of 4 interconnected modular buildings arranged in a rough square pattern around a central courtyard. The main laboratory building, where Rachel now stood, housed the bulk of the scientific equipment, including spectrometers, microscopes, computer workstations, and a sophisticated water analysis facility. The building was elevated 3 feet off the permafrost on adjustable steel pilings, with double-wall construction filled with high-grade insulation. The exterior walls were painted bright orange for visibility, though in the current conditions of late November, the building often disappeared entirely into the swirling snow. Adjacent to the laboratory was the Communications and Operations Center, a smaller building that contained the satellite communication equipment, weather monitoring station, and emergency supplies. The third building served as living quarters, with 8 individual sleeping rooms, a common area, kitchen facilities, and bathroom amenities. The fourth structure was designated for storage and maintenance, housing the backup generators, fuel supplies, scientific specimens, and repair equipment. All buildings were connected by enclosed walkways that could be sealed in severe weather conditions. Dr. Michael James Harrison, the expedition leader, was a 45-year-old glaciologist from the University of Colorado Boulder who had been coming to the Arctic for over 2 decades. His weather-beaten face bore the lines of someone who had spent countless hours in extreme conditions, and his grey-streaked beard was perpetually crusted with ice during outdoor work. Standing just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, developed from years of hauling scientific equipment across frozen terrain, Michael commanded respect from his team through his vast experience and calm demeanor under pressure. He had led 17 previous Arctic expeditions and was considered one of the foremost experts on polar ice dynamics in North America. The rest of the research team represented a carefully selected group of specialists in various Arctic sciences. Dr. Jennifer Louise Chen, 28 years old, was a climatologist from MIT whose groundbreaking work on atmospheric conditions above the Arctic Ocean had earned her recognition in the scientific community despite her young age. Born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents, Jennifer had discovered her passion for polar research during an undergraduate field trip to Alaska. She stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, but possessed an energy and enthusiasm that seemed to fill any room she entered. Her long black hair was often hidden beneath a thick wool cap, and her dark eyes missed nothing when it came to observing weather patterns. Dr. Thomas Richard Kowalski, 33 years old, served as the team's marine biologist and Rachel's primary research partner. The son of Polish immigrants who had settled in Chicago, Thomas had grown up fascinated by aquatic ecosystems and had specialized in cold water marine life during his graduate studies at the University of Michigan. His tall, lanky frame often made him appear awkward in the bulky Arctic gear, but his gentle nature and methodical approach to research made him an invaluable team member. He had been married to his high school sweetheart Maria for 8 years and carried photos of their 2 young children that he would show to anyone willing to look. Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery was the team's geologist, a 31-year-old expert in permafrost dynamics from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Having grown up in Anchorage, she was more comfortable in Arctic conditions than most of her colleagues, and her knowledge of the local environment often proved crucial during outdoor research activities. Sarah's compact build and sun-weathered skin spoke to years of fieldwork in harsh conditions, and her dry sense of humor helped maintain morale during the long, dark months of Arctic research. She had been working in the Arctic for over a decade and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather conditions and animal behavior. James Patrick Murphy, 26 years old, was the team's newest member, a PhD candidate in atmospheric physics from the University of Washington who had joined the expedition as part of his dissertation research. Tall and gangly with red hair and freckles, James brought a youthful enthusiasm to the team that sometimes irritated the more experienced researchers, but also provided a fresh perspective on long-standing problems. He had grown up in Seattle and had never experienced true Arctic conditions before this assignment, making every aspect of the expedition a learning experience for him. Dr. Elena Vasquez Rodriguez, 35 years old, served as the team's medical officer and biochemist. Born in Mexico City and educated at Johns Hopkins University, Elena had specialized in the effects of extreme environments on human physiology. Her presence on the team was considered essential given the remote location and potential for medical emergencies. Standing about 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair streaked with premature gray, Elena maintained a calm, professional demeanor that inspired confidence in her colleagues. She had completed emergency medical training and was qualified to handle everything from minor injuries to major trauma until more comprehensive medical care could be arranged. The final team member was David Lawrence Kim, a 29-year-old electronics and communications specialist from UC San Diego, whose job was to maintain the sophisticated equipment that kept the station operational and connected to the outside world. Of Korean descent, David had grown up in Los Angeles and possessed an almost magical ability to repair complex electronic systems under adverse conditions. His small stature and quiet demeanor masked a fierce intelligence and dedication to keeping the team's equipment functioning, despite the harsh Arctic environment. On the morning of December 3rd, the station had been operating normally for 18 days since the team's arrival. The routine had become comfortable and predictable. Wake up at 7 a.m., breakfast preparation and consumption by 8, outdoor data collection activities from 9 until noon, lunch and equipment maintenance from noon until 2 p.m., laboratory analysis and data processing from 2 until 6, dinner and team meetings from 6 until 8, and personal time until lights out at 11 p.m. The schedule was designed to maximize productivity while maintaining the mental health and physical condition of the team members during the long Arctic night. The weather conditions on December 3rd began typically for the season, with a temperature of -28 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour from the northeast. The sky was overcast with low-hanging clouds that created a ceiling of about 200 feet, limiting visibility to approximately half a mile in most directions. Snow had been falling intermittently for the past 3 days, adding another 8 inches to the already substantial accumulation around the station. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for the past 24 hours, indicating the approach of a significant weather system that was expected to bring heavy snow and high winds by evening. Rachel had spent the early morning hours analyzing water samples collected the previous day from open leads in the sea ice, approximately 2 miles north of the station. The samples contained phytoplankton specimens that showed unusual characteristics, possibly related to the changing ice conditions and increasing water temperatures that had been documented throughout the Arctic region. Her work was part of a larger study funded by the National Science Foundation to understand how marine ecosystems were adapting to rapidly changing Arctic conditions. Michael had been reviewing satellite imagery and weather data in the communications center, planning the next phase of ice core drilling that was scheduled to begin the following week. The drilling operation would require the team to establish a temporary camp approximately 5 miles from the main station, work that would be challenging under the best conditions and potentially dangerous if weather conditions deteriorated. He was particularly concerned about reports of unusual polar bear activity in the region, sightings that had been increasing in frequency over the past month. The polar bear population in the Beaufort Sea region had been under stress for several years due to changing ice conditions that affected their primary hunting grounds. Ursus maritimus, the scientific name for polar bears, are apex predators that depend on sea ice for hunting seals, their primary food source. Adult male polar bears can weigh between 800 and 1,500 pounds, with exceptional specimens reaching weights of over 1,700 pounds. They possess incredible strength, with the ability to break through ice several feet thick and drag seals weighing hundreds of pounds across considerable distances. Female polar bears typically weigh between 300 and 700 pounds and are generally more cautious around human settlements, especially when accompanied by cubs. However, both male and female polar bears have been known to display aggressive behavior toward humans when they feel threatened, are protecting cubs, or are experiencing food stress. The bears possess keen senses of smell that can detect seals beneath several feet of snow and ice from distances of up to 20 miles, and their hearing is similarly acute. The changing climate conditions in the Arctic had been forcing polar bears to adapt their behavior patterns in ways that brought them into increasing contact with human activities. Traditional hunting grounds were becoming less reliable as ice formed later and broke up earlier each year, forcing bears to travel greater distances in search of food. Some bears had begun to associate human settlements with potential food sources, either through scavenging or by learning to hunt in areas where human activity had attracted other wildlife. Dr. Sarah Montgomery had been tracking polar bear sightings in the region as part of her broader research into Arctic wildlife populations. Her data showed that bear sightings within 20 miles of the research station had increased by over 40% compared to the same period in previous years. More concerning was the fact that several of the sightings involved bears that appeared to be actively investigating human structures and equipment rather than simply passing through the area. 3 days earlier, on November 30th, David Kim had reported strange sounds around the communications building during his evening equipment check. He described hearing what sounded like scratching or scraping against the exterior walls, followed by heavy breathing that seemed too deep and powerful to be from any of the smaller Arctic animals common in the area. When he investigated the next morning, he found large paw prints in the snow around the building, prints that Sarah identified as belonging to a large male polar bear. The discovery of the tracks had prompted Michael to implement enhanced security protocols, including more frequent perimeter checks and a requirement that no team member work alone outside the main buildings. Emergency flares and air horns were distributed to all team members, and the locations of the emergency beacon and satellite phone were reviewed with everyone. However, the remote location of the station meant that immediate help would not be available in case of an emergency, with the nearest rescue assets located in Utqiagvik, over an hour away by helicopter under good weather conditions. Elena had conducted a briefing on polar bear behavior and safety procedures, drawing on information from wildlife authorities and her own research into animal attacks in remote locations. She emphasized that polar bears are one of the few large predators that actively hunt humans, unlike grizzly bears or black bears that typically attack only when surprised or defending cubs. She stressed the importance of making noise when moving around the station, avoiding sudden movements if a bear was encountered, and never attempting to run from a polar bear, which can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour despite their massive size. The team had practiced emergency procedures, including the use of emergency flares and the deployment of bear spray, though the effectiveness of bear spray in Arctic conditions was questionable due to wind and cold temperatures that could affect the dispersal pattern of the spray. The station was equipped with several high-powered emergency flares that could be fired into the air or directly at a threatening animal, and each building contained emergency air horns that could be used to attempt to scare away wildlife. Despite these precautions, the team members had gradually become complacent about the bear threat as days passed without any direct encounters. The demanding schedule of scientific work and the harsh weather conditions had created a routine that focused primarily on research activities and basic survival needs. The psychological stress of living in isolation and extreme conditions had also contributed to a tendency to downplay potential threats that were not immediately visible. Thomas Kowalski had been working late in the laboratory on December 2nd, processing marine samples collected during the previous week's diving operations beneath the sea ice. The diving had been conducted using a small, heated shelter positioned over a hole cut through approximately 4 feet of solid ice, allowing researchers to access the water column beneath while maintaining a controlled environment for equipment and personnel. The samples Thomas was analyzing contained microorganisms that were showing unusual adaptation patterns to the changing water chemistry caused by increased freshwater input from melting ice. Jennifer Chen had been monitoring atmospheric conditions throughout the day, noting the steady drop in barometric pressure and the increasing wind speeds that indicated the approach of a significant storm system. Her weather models predicted that conditions would begin to deteriorate rapidly after sunset, with wind speeds potentially reaching 60 miles per hour and snowfall rates of up to 2 inches per hour. Such conditions would make any outdoor activity extremely dangerous and would likely confine the team to the interior of the buildings for at least 24 hours. The storm warning had prompted the team to accelerate some planned outdoor activities, including the collection of additional ice samples and the maintenance of exterior equipment that would need to function throughout the storm period. James Murphy had volunteered to assist with the ice sample collection, eager to gain more experience with Arctic fieldwork, despite his relative inexperience with extreme weather conditions. As evening approached on December 3rd, the team had gathered in the common area of the living quarters building for their daily briefing and meal planning. The atmosphere was relaxed, with team members discussing their research findings and sharing stories from their various backgrounds and previous expeditions. Rachel had been particularly excited about some unusual organisms found in the latest water samples, microbes that seemed to be thriving in conditions that should have been hostile to most forms of life. The conversation had turned to plans for the upcoming drilling operation when David Kim reported a problem with the main communications antenna. Ice build-up on the satellite dish was affecting signal quality, and he was concerned that the approaching storm could cause a complete loss of communication if the problem was not addressed promptly. The loss of communications would isolate the team completely from the outside world, a situation that could become critical if an emergency occurred during the storm period. Michael made the decision to attempt to clear the antenna before conditions deteriorated further, despite the approaching darkness and increasing wind speeds. The antenna was mounted on the roof of the communications building, accessible by a ladder attached to the exterior wall. The job would normally be routine, but the Arctic conditions made any work at height extremely dangerous due to ice accumulation and the risk of equipment failure in extreme cold. David volunteered to perform the maintenance work, as he was most familiar with the communications equipment and the specific requirements for antenna adjustment. Elena insisted on accompanying him as a safety observer, following standard protocols for any potentially hazardous work in the Arctic environment. The two team members prepared carefully, donning their most weather-resistant clothing and checking their safety equipment multiple times before venturing outside. The exterior of the station presented a stark landscape of white and grey, with the buildings appearing as orange islands in an endless sea of snow and ice. The wind had increased to a steady 25 miles per hour, creating a constant background noise that made communication difficult even at close range. Visibility had decreased to less than a quarter mile in most directions, with blowing snow creating a disorienting effect that could cause even experienced Arctic travelers to become lost within sight of shelter. As David began climbing the ladder to reach the antenna, Elena positioned herself at the base to monitor his progress and maintain communication. The ladder rungs were heavily coated with ice, requiring careful placement of each foot and hand to maintain secure contact. David carried a small brush and scraper to remove ice accumulation from the antenna dish, tools that had been preheated in the building to prevent them from becoming too cold to handle effectively. The antenna maintenance required approximately 20 minutes to complete, during which Elena maintained constant visual contact with David and monitored radio communications with the team inside the buildings. The work proceeded normally, with David successfully removing the ice buildup and adjusting the antenna orientation to improve signal quality. However, as he prepared to descend the ladder, Elena noticed movement in the distance that immediately captured her attention. Approximately 200 yards to the northwest of the station, a large white shape was moving slowly across the snow-covered landscape. At first, Elena thought it might be a piece of equipment blown loose by the wind, but the movement pattern was too deliberate and organic to be debris. As she focused her attention on the shape, she realized with growing alarm that she was looking at a polar bear of exceptional size, moving steadily in the direction of the research station. The bear appeared to be a mature male, with the massive build and distinctive profile that characterized the largest specimens of the species. Even at a distance of 200 yards, Elena could see that the animal was significantly larger than the average polar bear, with a shoulder height that she estimated at over 4 feet and a body length that could exceed 10 feet. The bear's movement was purposeful and direct, showing none of the wandering behavior typical of bears that were simply passing through an area. Elena immediately activated her radio to alert the team inside the buildings while simultaneously attempting to get David's attention without making sudden movements that might attract the bear's attention. However, the combination of wind noise and David's concentration on his descent made communication difficult. She found herself in the terrible position of watching a potentially deadly predator approach while being unable to effectively warn her colleague who remained exposed on the ladder. The bear continued its steady approach, covering ground with the deceptively fast gait that allowed polar bears to travel vast distances across the Arctic landscape. Elena estimated that at the current rate of approach, the bear would reach the immediate vicinity of the station within 5 to 10 minutes, a time frame that would barely allow David to complete his descent and for both of them to reach the safety of the buildings. Elena's radio calls had alerted the team inside the station to the presence of the bear, and she could hear Michael Harrison's voice coordinating an emergency response. The emergency protocols called for all personnel to immediately retreat to the interior of the buildings, secure all entrances, and prepare emergency deterrent devices in case the bear attempted to breach the structures. However, the protocols had been developed with the assumption that all team members would be inside or immediately adjacent to the buildings when a bear was sighted. David had finally noticed Elena's frantic gesturing and had looked in the direction she was indicating, immediately spotting the approaching bear. His position on the ladder, still approximately 8 feet above the ground, put him in an extremely vulnerable situation. A fall from that height onto the ice-covered ground could result in serious injury, but remaining on the ladder would leave him completely exposed if the bear reached the building. The bear had closed the distance to approximately 100 yards and showed no signs of deviating from its direct approach to the station. Elena could now see details of the animal's massive head and powerful shoulders, and she was struck by the deliberate nature of its movement. This was not a bear that had accidentally wandered into the area of human activity. This was a predator that had detected something of interest and was investigating with the patient determination that made polar bears such effective hunters. David began his descent as quickly as safely possible, but the ice-covered ladder rungs required careful placement of each step to avoid a fall. Elena had retrieved emergency flares from her equipment pack and was preparing to fire them if the bear continued its approach. The flares were designed to create a bright light and loud noise that would hopefully startle the bear and cause it to retreat. But there was no guarantee that such deterrence would be effective against a large, determined predator. The team inside the buildings had been monitoring the situation through radio communication and had begun implementing emergency procedures. Michael Harrison had retrieved the high-powered emergency beacon that would send a distress signal to rescue authorities, though he knew that immediate assistance would not be available given the remote location and deteriorating weather conditions. Thomas Kowalski had gathered additional flares and was preparing to venture outside to assist Elena and David if necessary. Rachel Stein had moved to the laboratory building's main window to observe the developing situation, her scientific training warring with her growing fear as she watched the massive predator approach her colleagues. Through her binoculars, she could see details of the bear's behavior that increased her concern about its intentions. The bear's head was held high, indicating that it was actively scenting the air, and its ears were forward in an alert position that suggested focused attention rather than casual curiosity. The bear had approached to within 75 yards when David finally reached the ground and began moving quickly toward the entrance to the communications building. Elena had positioned herself between David and the bear, holding an emergency flare at the ready while trying to maintain visual contact with the predator. The bear paused in its approach, clearly aware of the human activity, but showing no immediate signs of retreating. At this point, several critical factors combined to transform what might have been a tense but manageable wildlife encounter into a developing crisis. The deteriorating weather conditions had reduced visibility and created noise that masked the sounds of human activity that might normally serve as a deterrent to wildlife. The bear's unusually large size and confident behavior suggested an animal that had little fear of humans and might have had previous encounters with human settlements. More significantly, the bear's approach coincided with the preparation of dinner in the living quarters building, an activity that involved the use of various foods with strong scents that could be detected by the bear's sensitive nose from considerable distances. The combination of food odors, human scent, and the artificial lighting from the buildings had created a concentration of stimuli that attracted the bear's attention and encouraged its investigation of the station. Elena fired the first emergency flare when the bear resumed its approach and closed to within 50 yards of the buildings. The flare created a brilliant red light and a sharp cracking sound as it arced through the air, landing in the snow approximately 20 yards in front of the bear. The animal paused and reared up on its hind legs, a behavior that allowed it to reach a height of over 8 feet and provided a better vantage point for assessing the situation. The sight of the massive bear standing upright sent a chill of primal fear through every member of the research team. From this position, the bear's true size became apparent, with a body mass that Rachel estimated at well over 1,000 pounds and possibly approaching the maximum size recorded for the species. The bear's black nose was clearly visible as it tested the air, and its small, dark eyes seemed to focus directly on the buildings where the research team had taken shelter. David had reached the entrance to the communications building and was frantically working to open the heavy door, which had become partially frozen shut due to ice accumulation around the frame. Elena maintained her position outside, unwilling to abandon her colleague while he struggled with the door. She had prepared a second flare and was considering whether to fire it immediately or wait to see how the bear responded to the first one. The bear dropped back to all 4 legs and resumed its approach, moving in a more cautious manner, but still showing clear intent to investigate the source of the interesting scents and sounds. Elena fired the second flare, this time aiming it directly at the bear, rather than placing it as a warning shot. The flare struck the snow just in front of the animal's massive paws, creating a spray of sparks and smoke that caused the bear to jump backward and shake its head vigorously. For a moment, it appeared that the deterrent might be effective. The bear moved laterally, circling to approach from a different angle, while maintaining a distance of approximately 40 yards from the buildings. This behavior gave David the time he needed to force open the door and disappear into the communications building, though he left the door partially open to maintain communication with Elena. However, the bear's circling behavior also revealed a level of intelligence and adaptability that was deeply troubling to the experienced Arctic researchers. Rather than retreating from the unfamiliar deterrent, the bear was adapting its approach to avoid the area where the flares had landed, while continuing to investigate the source of the attraction. This suggested an animal with significant experience and confidence, characteristics that made it far more dangerous than a typical bear that might be scared away by unusual sights and sounds. Elena began backing toward the entrance to the communications building, keeping the bear in sight while preparing to fire additional flares if necessary. The bear continued its circling movement, gradually working closer to the buildings while testing the air constantly with its sensitive nose. The animal's behavior suggested that it had detected something of significant interest, likely food scents from the dinner preparation activities. Michael Harrison had been coordinating the emergency response from inside the station, maintaining radio contact with Elena while preparing additional team members to provide assistance if needed. The emergency protocols called for the use of air horns and additional flares to create as much noise and disturbance as possible, with the goal of convincing the bear that the area was not worth investigating further. However, the protocols also emphasized that direct confrontation with a polar bear should be avoided at all costs due to the extreme danger posed by these powerful predators. The situation took a dramatic turn when the bear suddenly changed direction and moved rapidly toward the laboratory building, where Rachel Stein was observing through the main window. The bear's movement was swift and decisive, covering the remaining distance to the building in a matter of seconds and demonstrating the deceptive speed that made polar bears such effective predators. Rachel found herself face to face with the massive predator, separated only by the triple-paned window and the building's wall structure. The bear reared up against the side of the laboratory building, placing its massive front paws against the wall at a height of approximately 7 feet. From this position, the bear's head was level with the window where Rachel was standing, and she found herself looking directly into the small, dark eyes of one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. The bear's massive head was less than 3 feet away, and she could see details of its facial features, including the black nose that was actively scenting and the powerful jaws that could easily crush bones. The psychological impact of this close encounter was immediate and overwhelming. Rachel had studied polar bears extensively and understood their capabilities intellectually, but the reality of being in close proximity to such a massive and powerful predator triggered a primal fear response that made rational thought difficult. The bear's eyes seemed to focus directly on her, and she had the disturbing sensation that the animal was evaluating her as potential prey. The bear began testing the exterior of the building, using its powerful claws to scratch at the wall surface and probe for potential weak points. The scratching sounds were clearly audible inside the building, creating an atmosphere of intense tension among the research team members. The building had been designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, but it had not been specifically reinforced against polar bear attacks, and everyone was acutely aware that the animal possessed the strength to potentially damage or breach the structure. Elena had reached the communications building and was coordinating with David to activate additional emergency systems. The station was equipped with a high-powered emergency beacon that would alert rescue authorities to their situation, but the nearest rescue assets were located in Utqiagvik, over 30 miles away, and the deteriorating weather conditions would make any immediate rescue attempt extremely difficult. The team was essentially on their own until the bear lost interest and moved away from the station. The bear's investigation of the laboratory building continued for several minutes, during which the animal used its powerful sense of smell to detect the food scents and human activity inside. The bear moved systematically around the building, testing different areas and occasionally rearing up to investigate higher portions of the structure. The animal's behavior was methodical and intelligent, showing a level of problem-solving ability that was both fascinating and terrifying to the researchers who were observing. Thomas Kowalski had joined Rachel in the laboratory building and was documenting the bear's behavior with a video camera. Recognizing that this close encounter with a large polar bear represented a unique opportunity for scientific observation, despite the obvious danger. The bear's size and confident behavior suggested an exceptional specimen, and the detailed observation of its investigative techniques could provide valuable data for wildlife researchers studying polar bear behavior patterns. However, the scientific value of the encounter became secondary when the bear began to focus its attention on the laboratory building's entrance. The building's main door was located on the side facing the central courtyard, providing some protection from the harsh Arctic winds, but also creating a recessed area where scents could accumulate. The bear had detected the concentration of interesting odors around the entrance and was beginning to investigate more aggressively. The laboratory building's door was a heavy, insulated structure designed to maintain the building's internal temperature and provide security against weather conditions. However, like all the doors at the station, it had not been designed to withstand the determined efforts of a large polar bear. The door was secured with a standard lock mechanism and reinforced with weather stripping, but these features provided minimal protection against an animal capable of breaking through several feet of solid ice. Sarah Montgomery had been monitoring the situation from the living quarters building and had observed the bear's progression from investigating the exterior walls to focusing on the entrance. Her experience with Arctic wildlife had taught her that polar bears were persistent and intelligent predators, that would continue to investigate an area until they either found what they were looking for or determined that the effort was not worthwhile. The bear's increasingly focused attention on the laboratory building suggested that it had detected something of significant interest inside. The research team faced a critical decision about how to respond to the escalating situation. The emergency protocols provided guidance for various scenarios, but the current situation, a large polar bear actively investigating and potentially attempting to breach one of the station buildings, was at the extreme end of the threat spectrum. The protocols emphasized avoiding direct confrontation while using deterrent devices to encourage the bear to leave the area. But the bear's persistent behavior suggested that standard deterrent measures might not be effective. Michael Harrison made the decision to coordinate a more aggressive deterrent effort, using multiple air horns and emergency flares simultaneously to create maximum noise and disturbance. The goal was to convince the bear that the area was too chaotic and dangerous to be worth continued investigation. However, this approach carried the risk of further agitating the animal and potentially triggering more aggressive behavior. Elena had retrieved the station's supply of bear spray, though she was acutely aware that the effectiveness of such deterrents was questionable in the current weather conditions. The strong winds and cold temperatures could affect the spray pattern and reduce its effectiveness, and using bear spray would require getting within dangerous proximity to the bear. Nevertheless, she prepared the spray as a last resort if the bear attempted to breach one of the buildings. The coordinated deterrent effort began with the simultaneous activation of air horns from multiple buildings, creating a cacophony of sound that echoed across the frozen landscape. The noise was amplified by the buildings and the surrounding snow, creating an effect that was intended to be as disturbing as possible to the bear's sensitive hearing. Multiple emergency flares were fired into the air, creating bright lights and additional noise that added to the sensory assault. The bear's initial response to the coordinated deterrent effort was to move away from the laboratory building and seek a position where it could observe the source of the disturbance while maintaining some distance. However, rather than retreating from the area entirely, the bear moved to a position approximately 50 yards from the buildings and settled into a waiting posture that suggested it was not ready to abandon its investigation. This behavior was particularly troubling because it indicated a bear with significant experience and confidence around human activity. A typical polar bear encountering such an aggressive deterrent response would likely retreat to a safe distance and seek easier opportunities elsewhere. The fact that this bear was maintaining its position and continuing to observe the station suggested an animal that had learned to associate human settlements with food opportunities and was not easily discouraged. The standoff continued for approximately 30 minutes, during which the bear maintained its observation post while the research team remained secured inside the buildings. The deteriorating weather conditions had reduced visibility significantly, making it difficult to maintain constant visual contact with the bear. Snow was falling more heavily, and wind speeds had increased to over 30 miles per hour, creating a disorienting environment where the bear could potentially approach the buildings without being detected until it was very close. Jennifer Chen had been monitoring weather conditions throughout the crisis and reported that the approaching storm was intensifying more rapidly than initially predicted. Wind speeds were expected to reach 50 to 60 miles per hour within the next few hours, with snowfall rates of 2 inches per hour or more. Such conditions would make any outdoor activity extremely dangerous for humans, but polar bears were well adapted to severe weather and could continue to be active throughout the storm period. The combination of the approaching storm and the bear's persistent presence created a potentially critical situation for the research team. If the bear remained in the area throughout the storm period, the team could be effectively trapped in the buildings for 24 hours or more, unable to venture outside for any reason. This would prevent them from conducting essential maintenance activities, accessing emergency supplies stored in the storage building, or responding to any equipment failures that might occur during the storm. More critically, the approaching storm would make any rescue operation impossible until weather conditions improved. The emergency beacon had been activated and was transmitting the team's location and situation to rescue authorities, but helicopter operations would be suspended once wind speeds exceeded safe limits. The team would be entirely dependent on their own resources until the storm passed and rescue assets could be deployed. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been conducting a mental inventory of the medical supplies and emergency equipment available in each building, recognizing that the team might need to be self-sufficient for an extended period. The laboratory building where Rachel and Thomas were located contained basic first aid supplies, but lacked the more comprehensive medical equipment stored in the living quarters building. If anyone in the laboratory building were injured during the crisis, treating them could be extremely difficult. The psychological stress of the situation was beginning to affect all team members, though their scientific training helped them maintain focus on practical concerns and emergency procedures. The combination of isolation, extreme weather, and the presence of a dangerous predator created a level of stress that tested the mental preparation and emotional resilience of even the most experienced Arctic researchers. James Murphy, the youngest and least experienced team member, was having particular difficulty managing his anxiety about the situation. His lack of previous Arctic experience had not prepared him for the reality of facing a large predator in such a remote location, and he was struggling to maintain the calm demeanor that the situation required. Elena had been providing reassurance and guidance, helping him channel his nervous energy into useful activities like equipment checks and communication monitoring. As evening approached and darkness began to settle over the Arctic landscape, the visual tracking of the bear became increasingly difficult. The combination of reduced natural light, falling snow, and wind-blown snow particles created conditions where the bear could move without being detected until it was very close to the buildings. This forced the team to rely more heavily on sound detection, listening for the distinctive sounds of the bear's movement across the snow-covered ground. The bear had moved several times during the extended standoff, circling the buildings at various distances while maintaining its general surveillance of the station. Each movement created tension among the research team, as any change in the bear's position could indicate a renewed attempt to investigate or approach the buildings. The animal's persistence and patience demonstrated the behavioral characteristics that made polar bears such effective predators in their natural environment. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the situation escalated dramatically when the bear began a determined approach toward the storage building, located on the opposite side of the station from the laboratory building. The storage building contained fuel supplies, food stores, and emergency equipment, including additional deterrent devices and survival gear. However, it also contained various scented items that could attract the bear's attention, including emergency food supplies and materials used for equipment maintenance. The bear's approach to the storage building was more direct and aggressive than its previous investigations, suggesting that the animal had detected something of particular interest in that location. The building's construction was similar to the other structures at the station, with insulated walls and a reinforced door. But it had not been designed to withstand a determined effort by a large polar bear to gain entry. Sarah Montgomery, who was observing from the living quarters building, reported that the bear was using its powerful claws to investigate the door frame and surrounding wall area of the storage building. The scratching sounds were clearly audible even over the increasing wind noise, and she could see that the bear was causing visible damage to the exterior surface of the building. The animal's behavior suggested a level of determination that was far beyond casual curiosity. Michael Harrison made the decision to attempt a more aggressive deterrent action, recognizing that allowing the bear to damage or breach the storage building could compromise the team's survival capabilities during the storm period. The storage building contained critical supplies that would be needed if the team became stranded for an extended period, and its loss could create a life-threatening situation. The plan involved coordinating deterrent actions from multiple positions simultaneously, using emergency flares, air horns, and shouted commands to create maximum disturbance around the bear's position. Elena would attempt to get close enough to use bear spray if the opportunity presented itself, though this carried significant personal risk. The goal was to create such an overwhelming sensory assault that the bear would be forced to retreat from the immediate area. However, as the team prepared to implement the aggressive deterrent plan, the bear's behavior changed in a way that transformed the entire nature of the crisis. Rather than continuing to investigate the storage building's exterior, the bear began attempting to physically breach the door, using its massive strength and powerful claws. The sounds of splintering wood and metal could be heard clearly, indicating that the bear was causing significant structural damage to the building's entrance. The bear's transition from investigation to active attempts at entry represented a critical escalation that placed the entire team in immediate danger. A polar bear that was willing to breach human structures demonstrated a level of aggression and determination that made it an extreme threat to human safety. Such behavior suggested an animal that was either extremely hungry, had previous positive experiences with human settlements, or was displaying territorial aggression that could extend to attacking humans directly. Rachel Stein, observing from the laboratory building, could see that the bear's efforts were beginning to succeed in damaging the storage building's door. The door frame was showing signs of structural failure, and it appeared that the bear might be able to force entry within a matter of minutes. The implications of a polar bear gaining access to the team's emergency supplies and equipment were severe, potentially compromising their ability to survive until rescue could be arranged. The sound of splintering wood and the bear's powerful exertions created an atmosphere of mounting crisis that tested the team's ability to maintain rational decision-making under extreme stress. The combination of the approaching storm, the bear's aggressive behavior, and the potential loss of critical supplies created a scenario that was beyond the scope of the emergency procedures that had been developed for the station. Thomas Kowalski had been documenting the bear's behavior throughout the crisis, recognizing that the detailed observation of such an aggressive encounter could provide valuable scientific data if the team survived the experience. His footage showed the bear's systematic investigation techniques, its problem-solving abilities, and the escalation from curiosity to determined aggression. However, the scientific value of the documentation was becoming secondary to the immediate survival concerns facing the team. At 8:15 p.m., the bear succeeded in forcing open the storage building's door, creating a breach that allowed access to the interior of the structure. The sound of the door giving way was followed by the noise of the bear moving inside the building, investigating the various supplies and equipment stored there. The team could hear the sounds of items being moved and potentially damaged as the bear explored its new environment. The bear's entry into the storage building represented a critical turning point in the crisis. The animal had demonstrated that it possessed both the ability and the determination to breach the station's structures, calling into question the security of all the buildings. More immediately, the bear's presence in the storage building meant that it had access to various food supplies and scented materials that could reinforce its association of the station with potential feeding opportunities. Elena Rodriguez made the difficult decision to attempt a direct intervention, recognizing that allowing the bear to remain in the storage building could lead to an escalation that would threaten the entire team. Armed with bear spray and emergency flares, she prepared to leave the communications building and attempt to drive the bear away from the storage facility. This action carried extreme personal risk, as it would require approaching within close range of a large, aggressive polar bear that had already demonstrated its willingness to breach human structures. Michael Harrison coordinated the intervention effort, positioning team members in the other buildings to provide support and backup deterrent actions if Elena's attempt was unsuccessful. The plan involved creating a coordinated distraction that would draw the bear's attention away from the storage building, while Elena approached from a position that would allow her to use deterrent devices effectively. However, before the intervention could be implemented, the situation took another dramatic turn that changed the entire nature of the crisis. The bear emerged from the storage building carrying what appeared to be a package of emergency food supplies, demonstrating that it had not only gained access to the building, but had also identified and obtained exactly the type of material that would reinforce its interest in the station. The sight of the bear carrying food supplies from the storage building created a new level of crisis for the research team. The animal had now been rewarded for its aggressive behavior with access to human food, an experience that would strongly reinforce its association of the station with feeding opportunities. Polar bears have excellent memories and could return to locations where they have previously found food, potentially making the station a target for repeated visits. More immediately, the bear's success in obtaining food from the storage building could encourage it to attempt similar breaches of the other buildings where it had detected food scents. The laboratory building where Rachel and Thomas were located contained various food items used during long research sessions, and the living quarters building contained the main food supplies and cooking facilities that had been attracting the bear's attention throughout the evening. The bear moved to a position approximately 30 yards from the buildings and began consuming the food it had obtained from the storage building. This behavior allowed the research team to observe the animal's feeding patterns while providing a temporary respite from the immediate threat of further building breaches. However, the bear's position also demonstrated that it had no intention of leaving the area, instead settling in for an extended stay that could last throughout the approaching storm period. Jennifer Chen's weather monitoring indicated that the storm was beginning to reach full intensity, with wind speeds approaching 40 miles per hour and snowfall rates exceeding 1 inch per hour. Visibility had decreased to less than 100 yards in most directions, creating conditions where the bear could move around the station without being detected until it was very close to the buildings. The deteriorating conditions also made any outdoor activity extremely dangerous for the research team members. The combination of the bear's established presence and the severe weather conditions created a siege situation that could potentially last for 24 hours or more. The team would be trapped in their respective buildings, unable to venture outside for any reason, while a large, aggressive polar bear maintained control of the immediate area around the station. This scenario had not been anticipated in the emergency planning for the station, and the team was forced to develop survival strategies in real time. Dr. Sarah Montgomery, drawing on her extensive experience with Arctic wildlife, provided analysis of the bear's behavior that helped the team understand their situation more clearly. She explained that the bear's actions indicated an animal that was both intelligent and experienced with human settlements. The systematic investigation of the buildings, the successful breach of the storage facility, and the decision to remain in the area all suggested a bear that had learned to associate human activity with feeding opportunities. Sarah's analysis also indicated that the bear's behavior could become increasingly aggressive if it continued to detect food scents from the occupied buildings. Polar bears are opportunistic feeders that will take advantage of any available food source. and the animal had already demonstrated its willingness to breach human structures to access potential meals. The possibility that the bear might attempt to access the buildings containing research team members could not be dismissed. The team began implementing survival protocols designed for extended isolation, rationing food and water supplies while maintaining heating systems that would be essential during the storm period. The laboratory building where Rachel and Thomas were located had limited food supplies, primarily consisting of energy bars and instant beverages kept for use during long research sessions. The living quarters building contained the main food stores, but it also housed the largest number of team members, creating a more complex situation for resource management. Communication between the buildings was maintained through radio systems, allowing the team to coordinate their response and share information about the bear's movements and behavior. However, the radio communications also had to be conducted carefully to avoid creating noise that might attract the bear's attention to specific buildings. The team developed a system of brief, coded communications that provided essential information while minimizing the risk of drawing unwanted attention. As the evening progressed, the bear completed its consumption of the food obtained from the storage building and began a systematic investigation of the other structures. The animal moved methodically from building to building, testing doors and windows while using its acute sense of smell to detect the presence of additional food sources. The bear's behavior demonstrated a level of patience and thoroughness that was deeply unsettling to the research team members. The bear's investigation of the communications building where Elena and David were located proved particularly stressful, as the animal spent nearly 20 minutes examining the exterior of the structure. The bear used its powerful claws to test the doorframe and scratch at the walls, creating sounds that were clearly audible inside the building. Elena and David were forced to remain completely silent during this period, communicating only through hand signals, while the massive predator investigated their refuge. The psychological stress of remaining silent and motionless while a large polar bear attempted to find a way into their shelter tested the mental resilience of all team members. The knowledge that the bear possessed the physical capability to breach the building's defenses created a constant state of anxiety that made rational thought and decision-making extremely difficult. Elena later described the experience as the most terrifying of her life, despite her extensive experience with emergency medical situations. The bear's investigation of the living quarters building created an even more tense situation, as this structure contained the largest number of team members as well as the strongest concentration of food scents. Michael Harrison, Jennifer Chen, Sarah Montgomery, and James Murphy were all located in this building, creating a concentration of human scent that would be easily detectable by the bear's sensitive nose. The building also contained the main cooking facilities and food storage areas that had been the primary source of the scents attracting the bear throughout the evening. The bear spent nearly 30 minutes investigating the living quarters building, moving around the entire perimeter while testing various potential entry points. The animal's behavior indicated that it had detected the concentration of interesting scents associated with this structure, and was conducting a thorough evaluation of its potential for providing access to food sources. The team members inside the building were forced to remain completely silent during this period, communicating only through whispered radio transmissions when absolutely necessary. During the bear's investigation of the living quarters building, Sarah Montgomery observed behavior that provided additional insight into the animal's experience and intelligence. The bear was not randomly testing the building's exterior, but was systematically checking areas where structural weaknesses might exist, including window frames, door seals, and wall joints. This methodical approach suggested an animal with significant experience in evaluating human structures and identifying potential access points. The bear's focus on the living quarters building was also concerning because this structure housed the majority of the team's survival resources, including heating fuel, water supplies, and the main food stores. If the bear succeeded in breaching this building, the consequences could be catastrophic for the entire team's survival prospects during the extended storm period. The loss of heating fuel in particular could create a life-threatening situation given the extreme cold and wind conditions that were developing outside. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the bear began focusing its attention on the laboratory building where Rachel and Thomas were located. The animal's approach to this building was more direct and aggressive than its previous investigations, suggesting that it had detected something of particular interest in this location. The laboratory building contained various research samples and chemicals, but it also contained food supplies that had been stored for use during extended research sessions. The bear's investigation of the laboratory building quickly escalated beyond the level of curiosity that had characterized its earlier examinations of the other structures. The animal began using its powerful claws to actively scratch at the doorframe and surrounding wall areas, creating visible damage to the building's exterior surface. The scratching sounds were clearly audible inside the building, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension for Rachel and Thomas. Rachel found herself in the terrifying position of being only a few feet away from one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators, separated only by the building's wall and door structure. She could hear the bear's heavy breathing and the sounds of its claws working against the exterior surface of the building. The proximity of the massive predator triggered a primal fear response that made it difficult to think clearly or respond rationally to the developing crisis. Thomas had been attempting to document the bear's behavior throughout the crisis, but the escalating aggression of the animal's investigation made it clear that the situation was moving beyond scientific observation toward immediate personal danger. The bear's determination to investigate the laboratory building suggested that it had detected something of significant interest, and its willingness to damage the structure indicated a level of aggression that posed an immediate threat to the occupants. The bear's scratching at the laboratory building's doorframe was beginning to cause structural damage that could potentially compromise the integrity of the entrance. The door was secured with a standard lock mechanism, but the frame itself was showing signs of stress from the bear's powerful claws. Rachel and Thomas realized that the bear might be able to force entry if its efforts continued, a possibility that created a desperate urgency to find alternative safety measures. The laboratory building's layout provided limited options for creating additional barriers or escape routes. The building contained a rear exit that opened toward the central courtyard, but using this exit would require venturing outside, where the bear could easily intercept anyone attempting to reach another building. The building's windows were too small to serve as emergency exits, and the interior offered no secure areas that could provide protection if the bear succeeded in gaining entry. Thomas made the decision to prepare emergency deterrent devices in case the bear succeeded in breaching the door. He gathered the emergency flares and bear spray that were stored in the laboratory building, positioning them near the entrance where they could be used immediately if needed. However, both men were acutely aware that such deterrents would be minimally effective against a large polar bear in the confined space of the building's interior. The bear's efforts to breach the laboratory building continued for approximately 15 minutes, during which the animal's scratching and clawing created increasingly visible damage to the door frame and surrounding wall areas. The sounds of the bear's exertions were clearly audible to team members in the other buildings, creating a sense of shared crisis as everyone realized that one of their colleagues was facing immediate danger from the aggressive predator. Michael Harrison attempted to coordinate a distraction effort designed to draw the bear away from the laboratory building. But the severe weather conditions and the bear's focused attention made it difficult to implement effective deterrent actions from the other structures. The team was forced to watch helplessly as the bear continued its determined efforts to access the building where Rachel and Thomas were trapped. At approximately 10 p.m., the bear's persistence was rewarded when its claws found a weakness in the doorframe structure. The combination of the extreme cold, which had made the metal components brittle, and the bear's powerful scratching action created a failure point that allowed the animal to begin forcing the door open. The sound of the frame giving way was clearly audible both inside and outside the laboratory building, signaling a critical escalation in the crisis. Rachel and Thomas found themselves facing the immediate prospect of a large, aggressive polar bear gaining access to their shelter. The psychological impact of this realization was overwhelming, triggering fight-or-flight responses that made coordinated action extremely difficult. However, their scientific training and experience with emergency procedures helped them maintain enough composure to attempt defensive measures. Thomas positioned himself near the door with emergency flares and bear spray ready for immediate use, while Rachel moved to the rear of the building where she could potentially escape through the back exit if necessary. However, both team members were acutely aware that their defensive options were extremely limited against a predator of the polar bear's size and power. The confined space of the building's interior would actually work to the bear's advantage in any direct confrontation. The bear succeeded in forcing the laboratory building's door partially open, creating a gap of approximately 8 inches that allowed cold air and snow to begin entering the building. The animal's massive head became visible through the opening, and Rachel could see details of the bear's facial features, including the black nose that was actively scenting the interior of the building. The proximity of the predator was psychologically overwhelming, creating a level of fear that threatened to paralyze rational thought and action. However, the partial opening of the door also provided Thomas with an opportunity to use the emergency deterrent devices while the bear was still partially outside the building. He fired an emergency flare directly at the bear's head, creating a brilliant flash of light and a sharp cracking sound in the confined space near the entrance. The flare struck the doorframe near the bear's head, creating a shower of sparks and smoke that caused the animal to jerk backward and temporarily abandon its efforts to force the door. The flare's effect provided a brief respite that allowed Rachel and Thomas to reposition themselves and prepare additional defensive measures. However, they were acutely aware that the bear had demonstrated both the ability and determination to breach the building's defenses, and that the temporary retreat might not last long. The animal had been so close to gaining complete access that its return seemed inevitable. The bear's brief retreat from the laboratory building allowed Michael Harrison to coordinate a more comprehensive deterrent effort from the other structures. Emergency flares were fired from multiple positions simultaneously, creating a barrage of lights and noise designed to overwhelm the bear's senses and convince it to abandon its focus on the laboratory building. Air horns were activated from all occupied buildings, creating a cacophony of sound that echoed across the storm-swept landscape. The coordinated deterrent effort succeeded in drawing the bear away from the immediate vicinity of the laboratory building, providing Rachel and Thomas with an opportunity to assess the damage to their shelter and implement additional security measures. However, the bear did not retreat to a significant distance, instead moving to a position approximately 50 yards away where it could continue to observe the station while remaining outside the immediate range of the deterrent devices. The partial breach of the laboratory building had demonstrated that the station's structures could not provide absolute protection against a determined polar bear attack. This realization forced the research team to develop new survival strategies that assumed the possibility of further building breaches. The team began identifying potential refuge areas within each building and preparing emergency escape procedures that could be implemented if the bear succeeded in gaining complete access to any structure. Elena Rodriguez, drawing on her medical training and emergency response experience, provided guidance on barricading techniques that could be used to strengthen the building's defenses. She recommended using research equipment, furniture and supplies to create additional barriers behind the main doors, though she acknowledged that such measures would provide only limited protection against a large polar bear's strength. The bear's temporary retreat also provided an opportunity for the team to reassess their communication with rescue authorities. The emergency beacon had been transmitting throughout the crisis, but the severe weather conditions had prevented any immediate rescue response. David Kim reported that radio communications with the outside world were becoming increasingly difficult due to atmospheric conditions associated with the storm, raising the possibility that the team might lose all contact with potential rescue assets. Jennifer Chen's weather analysis indicated that the storm was approaching peak intensity, with wind speeds now exceeding 50 miles per hour and snowfall rates of over 2 inches per hour. These conditions would make any helicopter rescue operation impossible, and even ground-based rescue efforts would be extremely dangerous for rescue personnel. The team was forced to accept that they would need to survive the crisis using only their own resources until weather conditions improved enough to allow rescue operations. The psychological stress of prolonged isolation with a dangerous predator was beginning to affect all team members, though their scientific training and experience with extreme conditions helped them maintain focus on practical survival needs. James Murphy, the youngest team member, was having particular difficulty managing his anxiety, and Elena had been providing counseling and support to help him maintain psychological stability during the crisis. As the storm reached full intensity around 11 p.m., the bear's behavior changed in response to the deteriorating weather conditions. Rather than continuing its systematic investigation of the buildings, the animal sought shelter in the lee of the storage building where it had initially gained access to food supplies. This behavior suggested that even polar bears, despite their adaptation to extreme Arctic conditions, preferred to avoid the worst effects of severe storms when possible. The bear's choice to seek shelter near the storage building was both a relief and a continuing source of concern for the research team. While the animal was no longer actively investigating the occupied buildings, its continued presence in the immediate area meant that the team remained effectively trapped in their respective structures. Any attempt to venture outside for emergency supplies, equipment maintenance, or building-to-building movement would carry extreme risk of encountering the predator. The storm's intensity also created new challenges for maintaining the station's essential systems during the extended crisis period. Heating systems required periodic maintenance and fuel replenishment, communication equipment needed protection from ice accumulation, and backup power systems required monitoring to ensure continued operation. However, all of these maintenance activities normally required brief outdoor exposure that was now impossible due to the bear's presence. Rachel and Thomas had been working to reinforce the damaged doorframe of the laboratory building using research equipment and supplies available in the structure. They created a barricade using heavy laboratory benches and equipment cases, though they were acutely aware that such measures provided only psychological comfort rather than effective protection against a determined polar bear. The damage to the doorframe had compromised the building's weather seal, allowing cold air and snow to enter the interior and creating additional stress on the heating system. The temperature inside the laboratory building had dropped several degrees due to the compromised door seal, forcing Rachel and Thomas to conserve body heat while maintaining essential equipment operation. They had access to emergency blankets and additional clothing, But the prolonged exposure to cold conditions in combination with the psychological stress of the crisis was beginning to affect their physical condition and decision-making capabilities. Thomas had been documenting the bear's behavior throughout the crisis, creating a record that could provide valuable scientific data about polar bear responses to human settlements and deterrent measures. His observations showed that the bear had demonstrated remarkable intelligence and adaptability, systematically investigating the station's defenses and successfully breaching structures that were thought to be secure against wildlife encounters. The bear's success in obtaining food from the storage building had created a conditioning experience that would likely influence its future behavior around human settlements. Polar bears have excellent long-term memories and could remember successful feeding locations for years, potentially making the research station a target for repeated visits by this animal or others that might learn from its example. As midnight approached, the storm reached its peak intensity with wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and snowfall creating near-zero visibility conditions. The research station was completely isolated from the outside world, with communication systems struggling to maintain contact through the atmospheric disturbance created by the severe weather. The combination of the storm and the bear's presence created a survival situation that tested the limits of the team's preparation and resources. The bear had remained in its sheltered position near the storage building throughout the evening, occasionally moving short distances but showing no signs of abandoning the area. The animal's persistence suggested that it had made a long-term commitment to investigating the station and would likely remain in the vicinity until it had thoroughly explored all potential food sources or until other factors forced it to move on. Elena Rodriguez had been monitoring the psychological condition of all team members throughout the crisis, recognizing that the combination of isolation, fear, and extreme stress could lead to poor decision-making or panic responses that would increase the danger to everyone. She had been providing regular check-ins with each team member through radio communications, offering support and maintaining the social connections that were essential for group survival in crisis situations. The extended nature of the crisis was beginning to strain the team's resources and psychological resilience. Food and water supplies in the individual buildings were limited, and the inability to access the main supply stores created concerns about sustaining the team through an extended isolation period. More critically, the heating fuel in each building was designed for normal operation rather than extended crisis periods, and the compromised weather seal in the laboratory building was placing additional strain on that structure's heating system. Michael Harrison had been developing contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop as the crisis continued. These included procedures for emergency evacuation between buildings if life-threatening conditions developed, protocols for rationing supplies if the isolation period extended beyond expected timeframes, and communication procedures for coordinating with rescue authorities when weather conditions improved. The team's emergency beacon continued to transmit their location and situation to rescue authorities, though the severe weather conditions prevented any immediate response. The nearest rescue assets were helicopter units based in Utqiagvik, but these aircraft could not operate safely in wind speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. Ground-based rescue operations would require several hours of travel time across extremely hazardous terrain, making immediate assistance impossible. As the crisis extended into the early morning hours of December 4th, the psychological stress of the prolonged emergency began to manifest in various ways among the team members. Sleep was virtually impossible due to the combination of fear, cold, and the need to maintain constant awareness of the bear's movements. The lack of rest was beginning to affect judgment and physical coordination, creating additional safety concerns beyond the immediate threat posed by the predator. Rachel found herself experiencing a range of intense emotions as the crisis continued through the night. The scientific part of her mind remained fascinated by the opportunity to observe polar bear behavior at close range. But this intellectual interest was overwhelmed by the primal fear response triggered by the animal's proximity and aggressive behavior. She had never experienced such immediate physical danger during her research career, and the psychological impact was unlike anything she had previously encountered. The bear's continued presence near the station represented a fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying Arctic research operations. The emergency procedures and facility designs were based on the expectation that wildlife encounters could be managed through standard deterrent measures, and that aggressive behavior could be discouraged through appropriate responses. However, the current situation demonstrated that these assumptions might not be valid when dealing with large, experienced, and persistent predators. Thomas had been analyzing the bear's behavior patterns throughout the night, attempting to identify factors that might influence the animal's decision to remain in the area or move on to other locations. His observations suggested that the bear had established the station as a temporary territory, marking it with scent and defending it against the deterrent efforts of the research team. This territorial behavior was concerning because it suggested that the bear might remain in the area for an extended period, rather than moving on after a brief investigation. The storm had created additional complications for any potential rescue operations by obscuring landmarks and creating hazardous travel conditions across the surrounding terrain. Even if weather conditions improved enough to allow helicopter operations, the pilots would face significant challenges in locating and accessing the research station safely. The bear's presence added another layer of complexity, as rescue personnel would need to consider the predator threat when planning any approach to the facility. Jennifer Chen's meteorological analysis indicated that the storm system was beginning to show signs of weakening, though severe conditions would likely continue for several more hours. Wind speeds were expected to begin decreasing after sunrise, potentially dropping below the threshold that prevented helicopter operations by mid-morning. However, the timing of any rescue operation would depend on multiple factors, including the availability of aircraft and crews, the specific weather conditions at the rescue launch point, and the continued presence of the polar bear at the station. The approaching dawn brought some psychological relief to the research team, as the return of natural light would improve visibility and make it easier to monitor the bear's movements and behavior. However, daylight would also reveal the full extent of the damage caused by the bear's investigations and the storm's effects on the station's structures and equipment. The team would need to assess their situation carefully and develop plans for addressing any critical system failures or structural damage. As the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon around 7 a.m., the bear's behavior showed signs of change that provided both hope and concern for the research team. The animal had become more active with the approaching daylight, moving around the immediate area of the station and conducting what appeared to be a renewed investigation of the buildings. However, the bear's movements seemed less focused than during the previous evening, suggesting that its immediate interest in the station might be beginning to wane. The bear's renewed activity coincided with a gradual decrease in the storm's intensity, with wind speeds dropping to approximately 35 miles per hour and snowfall becoming less dense. These improved conditions would make any deterrent efforts more effective and would also improve the possibilities for rescue operations if the bear could be convinced to leave the immediate area of the station. Elena Rodriguez had been preparing a comprehensive deterrent plan that could be implemented once weather conditions improved sufficiently to allow coordinated action. The plan involved simultaneous deterrent activities from all occupied buildings, creating maximum noise and disturbance while using emergency flares to establish a perimeter around the bear that would encourage it to move away from the station. The goal was to create an environment that would be sufficiently unpleasant for the bear that it would choose to seek more peaceful surroundings elsewhere. However, implementing the deterrent plan would require careful coordination and timing to avoid triggering more aggressive behavior from the bear. The animal had already demonstrated its willingness to breach human structures when sufficiently motivated, and an unsuccessful deterrent effort could potentially provoke an escalated response that would place the entire team in greater danger. Rachel and Thomas had spent the night implementing additional security measures in the laboratory building, using research equipment to create barriers and preparing emergency escape procedures in case the bear succeeded in breaching the damaged door. Their efforts had helped maintain the building's interior temperature and had provided some psychological comfort, though they remained acutely aware that their defenses would be minimally effective against a determined polar bear attack. The damage to the laboratory building's doorframe had created ongoing concerns about the structure's integrity and weather resistance. Cold air continued to enter the building through gaps created by the bear's claws, and ice was beginning to accumulate around the damaged areas. These conditions would become increasingly problematic if the crisis extended much longer, potentially creating heating system failures that could threaten the occupants' survival. As the morning progressed, the research team began receiving intermittent radio communications from rescue authorities in Utqiagvik, indicating that helicopter assets were being prepared for deployment as soon as weather conditions permitted safe operations. The rescue teams had been monitoring the emergency beacon transmissions throughout the night and were fully aware of the team's situation, including the presence of the aggressive polar bear at the station. The rescue operation would involve multiple aircraft and specialized personnel trained in Arctic rescue operations and wildlife encounters. The teams included medical personnel who could provide immediate treatment for any injuries, wildlife specialists who could assess and manage the polar bear threat, and technical specialists who could evaluate and repair damage to the station's critical systems. However, the rescue operation would be extremely complex due to the combination of challenging weather conditions, the remote location of the station, the presence of a large, aggressive predator that had already demonstrated its willingness to attack human structures. The rescue teams would need to approach the situation with extreme caution to avoid triggering additional aggressive behavior from the bear, while ensuring the safety of both the research team and the rescue personnel. The bear's behavior during the morning hours provided some hope that the animal's interest in the station might be beginning to decrease. The bear had moved to a position approximately 100 yards from the buildings and was spending more time in what appeared to be resting behavior rather than active investigation. However, the animal remained clearly visible and had not shown any signs of leaving the immediate area entirely. Dr. Sarah Montgomery, drawing on her extensive experience with Arctic wildlife, provided analysis suggesting that the bear's behavior was transitioning from active investigation to territorial surveillance. The animal had established the station area as part of its temporary territory and was maintaining a watching presence while determining whether continued investigation would be worthwhile. This behavior pattern suggested that the bear might remain in the area for several more hours, or potentially even days, before moving on to other locations. The psychological stress of the prolonged crisis was beginning to show more significant effects on team members as the situation extended into its second day. The combination of fear, exhaustion, cold, and isolation was affecting judgment and emotional stability, creating concerns about the team's ability to make sound decisions if the crisis continued much longer. Elena had been monitoring these effects carefully and providing support to help maintain group cohesion and individual psychological stability. James Murphy, the youngest team member, was experiencing particular difficulty with the psychological demands of the situation. His lack of previous Arctic experience had not prepared him for the reality of facing such immediate danger in such a remote location, and the extended nature of the crisis was testing his emotional resilience. Elena had been providing regular counseling support and encouraging him to focus on specific tasks that would help maintain his sense of purpose and contribution to the team's survival. As mid-morning approached, the weather conditions had improved sufficiently that radio communications with rescue authorities became more reliable and consistent. The rescue teams reported that helicopter operations were being prepared for launch within the next 2 hours, pending final weather assessments and the development of specific procedures for dealing with the polar bear threat at the station site. The rescue operation would involve a coordinated approach designed to minimize the risk to both the research team and the rescue personnel. The initial phase would involve wildlife specialists using aircraft-based deterrent methods to encourage the bear to move away from the immediate area of the station. Once the bear had been successfully deterred, medical and evacuation teams would land to assess the team's condition and begin the evacuation process. However, the rescue teams emphasized that the operation would need to be conducted with extreme caution and might need to be aborted if the bear's behavior indicated that the deterrent efforts were not successful. The safety of personnel on the ground would be the primary consideration, and the rescue teams would not risk creating a situation where additional people could be endangered by the aggressive predator. The prospect of imminent rescue provided significant psychological relief to the research team, though they remained acutely aware that the rescue operation itself would involve considerable risk and complexity. The presence of the polar bear added a level of unpredictability to the situation that could affect the success of any rescue attempt, and the team prepared themselves for the possibility that multiple attempts might be necessary before evacuation could be completed successfully. Rachel found herself experiencing conflicting emotions about the approaching rescue operation. While she desperately wanted to escape the immediate danger posed by the polar bear, she also recognized that the crisis had provided an unprecedented opportunity to observe polar bear behavior under unique circumstances. Her scientific training made her reluctant to abandon the observation opportunity, even though her personal safety clearly required evacuation from the dangerous situation. Thomas had been documenting the bear's behavior throughout the crisis and had accumulated what would likely prove to be valuable scientific data about polar bear responses to human settlements and deterrent measures. However, much of his equipment had been used to create defensive barriers in the laboratory building, and he was concerned about preserving the documentation if the evacuation process required abandoning research materials and equipment. The bear's position during the late morning hours remained relatively stable, with the animal maintaining its surveillance post approximately 100 yards from the station buildings. The bear's behavior suggested continued interest in the area, but reduced immediate aggression compared to the previous evening's determined efforts to breach the buildings. This behavioral change provided some optimism that deterrent efforts might be successful in encouraging the bear to move away from the station. Michael Harrison had been coordinating with rescue authorities to develop specific procedures for the evacuation operation that would account for the bear's presence and behavior patterns. The rescue teams would approach the station from a direction that would minimize the risk of surprising the bear while maximizing their ability to implement deterrent measures if necessary. The evacuation would be conducted in stages, with priority given to team members who were in the most vulnerable positions or who had medical needs requiring immediate attention. Elena Rodriguez had been conducting medical assessments of all team members through radio communications, evaluating their physical and psychological condition to help rescue teams prepare appropriate medical support. While no team members had suffered serious physical injuries during the crisis, The prolonged stress and exposure to cold conditions had affected everyone's physical condition to some degree. The psychological trauma of the experience would require ongoing support and treatment after the immediate crisis was resolved. The storage building that had been breached by the bear represented a significant loss of critical supplies and equipment, including emergency food stores, fuel supplies, and backup equipment that would normally be essential for continued station operations. The bear's presence in and around this building had also contaminated many remaining supplies with bear scent, making them potentially dangerous to access even after the animal had moved away from the area. As noon approached, the research team received confirmation that rescue helicopters had launched from Utqiagvik and were en route to the station location. The flight time was estimated at approximately 45 minutes, depending on weather conditions and the specific approach route selected to minimize risk during the landing and evacuation operations. The rescue teams included wildlife specialists, medical personnel, and aviation crews experienced in Arctic rescue operations. The approaching rescue operation marked the beginning of what would likely be the most dangerous phase of the entire crisis. While the bear had shown some signs of reduced aggression during the morning hours, the arrival of helicopters and additional human activity could potentially trigger renewed aggressive behavior. The rescue teams were prepared for this possibility and had developed contingency plans for various scenarios, but the unpredictable nature of polar bear behavior meant that the situation could change rapidly and unexpectedly. Rachel and Thomas began preparing for evacuation from the laboratory building, gathering essential personal items and research materials while maintaining their defensive positions near the damaged door. The evacuation process would require them to leave the relative safety of the building and move across open ground to reach the helicopter landing zone, an activity that would expose them to potential attack by the polar bear if deterrent efforts were not successful. The psychological anticipation of the rescue operation created a complex mix of hope and anxiety among all team members. While everyone desperately wanted to escape the dangerous situation, the knowledge that the rescue process itself would involve significant risk created ongoing stress and concern. The team members had developed coping mechanisms for dealing with the static threat of the bear's presence, but the dynamic nature of an active rescue operation would require different psychological and physical preparations. Jennifer Chen continued monitoring weather conditions to provide real-time updates to the rescue teams, ensuring that they had the most current information about wind speeds, visibility, and other factors that could affect the safety of helicopter operations. The weather conditions had continued to improve throughout the morning, with wind speeds dropping to approximately 25 miles per hour and visibility increasing to over half a mile in most directions. The bear's response to the improving weather conditions had been to increase its activity level and expand its investigative range around the station. While the animal had not returned to the aggressive building investigations of the previous evening, it had been moving more frequently and appeared to be conducting a broader survey of the area. This increased activity created concerns about how the bear might respond to the arrival of helicopters and rescue personnel. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the rescue helicopters became visible on the southern horizon, approaching the station in a formation designed to provide maximum flexibility for implementing deterrent measures and evacuation procedures. The sight of the aircraft provided immense psychological relief to the research team, though everyone remained aware that the most dangerous phase of the crisis was just beginning. The bear's response to the approaching helicopters was immediate and dramatic. The animal stood up on its hind legs, reaching its full height of over 8 feet, and began moving rapidly toward a position that would provide better observation of the approaching aircraft. The bear's behavior indicated high alertness and potential agitation, suggesting that the arrival of the helicopters had triggered a significant stress response in the predator. The lead helicopter maintained a safe distance while wildlife specialists assessed the bear's behavior and position relative to the station buildings and the planned landing zone. The rescue teams had prepared multiple deterrent options, including noisemakers, flares, and other devices designed to encourage the bear to move away from the immediate area without triggering more aggressive behavior. The first deterrent attempt involved the helicopter flying in a pattern designed to create maximum noise and visual disturbance while maintaining a safe distance from both the bear and the station buildings. The aircraft's rotor noise and movement were intended to create an environment that would be sufficiently unpleasant for the bear that it would choose to retreat to a more comfortable location away from the station. However, the bear's response to the initial deterrent efforts was not what the rescue teams had hoped for. Rather than retreating from the area, the bear moved closer to the station buildings, apparently seeking shelter from the disturbing helicopter activity. This behavior placed the predator in a position where it could potentially interfere with evacuation operations and posed an increased threat to team members who would need to leave the buildings to reach the landing zone. The rescue teams were forced to reassess their approach based on the bear's unexpected response to the helicopter presence. The wildlife specialists recognized that the animal was displaying defensive rather than aggressive behavior, suggesting that it viewed the station buildings as a refuge from the threatening aircraft rather than as objects to be investigated or attacked. However, this defensive positioning still created significant complications for the evacuation operation. Rachel and Thomas, observing from the laboratory building, could see that the bear had moved to a position between their building and the planned helicopter landing zone. This positioning would require them to approach within close range of the predator during their evacuation, creating an extremely dangerous situation that could trigger aggressive behavior if the bear felt cornered or threatened by human movement. The rescue operation was temporarily suspended while teams developed alternative approaches that would account for the bear's defensive positioning. Options included attempting to lure the bear away from the buildings using food or scent attractants, implementing more aggressive deterrent measures to force the animal to retreat, or waiting for the bear to move voluntarily to a position that would allow safer evacuation procedures. Michael Harrison, communicating with rescue teams through radio, provided detailed information about the bear's behavior patterns throughout the crisis. His observations suggested that the animal had established a strong association with the station area and might not be easily deterred by standard wildlife management techniques. The bear's success in obtaining food from the storage building had created a conditioning experience that could make it reluctant to abandon the area voluntarily. The complexity of the rescue operation was further increased by the need to coordinate multiple aircraft, ground personnel, and equipment while maintaining safety margins for all personnel involved. The presence of the polar bear created variables that could change rapidly and unpredictably, requiring constant reassessment of procedures and safety protocols throughout the operation. Elena Rodriguez had been preparing medical assessment and treatment protocols for the evacuation process, recognizing that the combination of physical stress, psychological trauma, and potential exposure injuries would require immediate attention for all team members. She had been particularly concerned about Rachel and Thomas, who had been exposed to the greatest direct threat and had experienced the most severe psychological stress during the crisis. As the rescue teams worked to develop alternative approaches, the bear's behavior continued to evolve in response to the helicopter activity. The animal had initially sought shelter near the buildings, but was now beginning to investigate the aircraft with the same systematic curiosity that it had displayed toward the station structures. This behavioral shift suggested that the bear was adapting to the new stimuli and might become more unpredictable as it gained familiarity with the helicopter presence. The psychological stress of waiting for rescue while watching the complex interactions between the bear and the rescue teams created additional challenges for the research team members. The proximity of help combined with the continued danger created an emotional tension that was difficult to manage, and several team members reported feeling more anxious during the rescue attempt than they had during the static siege period of the previous night. Dr. Sarah Montgomery, observing the bear's behavior during the rescue operation, noted that the animal was displaying intelligence and adaptability that exceeded what she had previously observed in polar bear encounters. The bear's ability to assess and respond to changing circumstances suggested an exceptional individual that might have significant experience with human activity and technological intrusions into its environment. At approximately 1:15 p.m., the rescue teams implemented a coordinated deterrent effort involving multiple helicopters and ground-based distraction devices operated by team members in the station buildings. The goal was to create sufficient sensory overload that the bear would be compelled to retreat from the immediate area, providing a safe corridor for evacuation operations. The coordinated deterrent effort involved helicopters flying in formation to create maximum noise and rotor wash effects, while emergency flares were fired from multiple station buildings to create visual and auditory disturbance on the ground. Air horns and other noisemakers were activated simultaneously to create a cacophony of sound that would be extremely unpleasant for the bear's sensitive hearing. The initial response to the coordinated deterrent effort appeared promising as the bear began moving away from the station buildings toward a position that would provide more distance from the disturbing stimuli. However, the animal's movement was cautious and reluctant, suggesting that it was not fully convinced to abandon its association with the station area. The rescue team seized the opportunity created by the bear's movement to begin the first phase of the evacuation operation. A helicopter approached the station to establish a landing zone while maintaining readiness to abort the operation if the bear's behavior indicated renewed aggression or territorial defense. The landing would be conducted as quickly as possible to minimize the time during which personnel would be vulnerable on the ground. Rachel and Thomas prepared for immediate evacuation from the laboratory building, gathering essential personal items while maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position and behavior. The evacuation would require them to move approximately 50 yards across open ground to reach the helicopter landing zone, an activity that would expose them to potential attack if the bear decided to defend its territory against human intrusion. The helicopter landing was executed successfully despite challenging wind conditions and the need to maintain constant awareness of the bear's position and potential responses. The aircraft crew included medical personnel who were prepared to provide immediate treatment for any injuries and wildlife specialists who could implement additional deterrent measures if the bear's behavior became threatening. The evacuation of Rachel and Thomas from the laboratory building was conducted with extreme caution, using procedures designed to minimize the risk of triggering aggressive behavior from the bear. The team members moved slowly and deliberately toward the helicopter, while rescue personnel maintained deterrent devices ready for immediate use if necessary. The bear observed the human activity from a distance of approximately 100 yards, but did not show signs of immediate aggressive intention. The successful evacuation of the first team members provided significant relief to the remaining researchers and demonstrated that the rescue operation could be conducted safely despite the bear's continued presence in the area. However, each subsequent evacuation would involve similar risks, and the bear's tolerance for human activity could change unpredictably as the operation continued. The evacuation of Michael Harrison, Jennifer Chen, Sarah Montgomery, and James Murphy from the living quarters building proceeded smoothly, with the bear maintaining its observation post at a safe distance while showing no signs of aggressive behavior. The rescue teams had established effective deterrent procedures that appeared to be successful in managing the bear's responses to human activity. Elena Rodriguez and David Kim were evacuated from the communications building in the final phase of the rescue operation, completing the removal of all research team members from the dangerous situation. The evacuation had been conducted without triggering aggressive behavior from the bear, though the animal remained clearly visible in the area and had not abandoned its association with the station location. The helicopter evacuation flight to Utqiagvik provided the first opportunity for research team members to begin processing the psychological trauma of their experience while receiving initial medical assessment and treatment. The medical personnel on board the aircraft were experienced in treating exposure injuries and psychological trauma associated with Arctic emergencies, and they began immediate interventions to address the physical and emotional effects of the crisis. Rachel found herself experiencing a complex mix of emotions during the evacuation flight, including relief at escaping immediate danger, exhaustion from the prolonged stress, and a sense of loss at abandoning the research work that had brought her to the Arctic. The scientific part of her mind remained fascinated by the behavioral observations they had made during the crisis, but this intellectual interest was overwhelmed by the psychological impact of facing such immediate personal danger. The arrival at the medical facilities in Utqiagvik marked the beginning of a comprehensive evaluation and treatment process for all team members. Medical personnel conducted thorough physical examinations to assess for exposure injuries, dehydration, and other effects of the prolonged crisis, while psychological counselors began initial interventions to address the trauma associated with the polar bear encounter. Thomas had managed to preserve most of his documentation of the bear's behavior during the crisis, providing a unique record of polar bear responses to human settlements and deterrent measures. His footage and observations would prove valuable for wildlife researchers studying polar bear behavior patterns and for developing improved safety procedures for Arctic research operations. The research station remained uninhabitable following the crisis, with significant damage to the storage building and laboratory building that would require extensive repairs before operations could resume. The bear's successful breach of the storage facility had demonstrated vulnerabilities in the station's design that would need to be addressed in future construction and safety planning for Arctic research facilities. The polar bear itself remained in the vicinity of the research station for several days following the evacuation, suggesting that the animal had established a strong association with the location and the food rewards it had obtained during the crisis. Wildlife authorities would need to monitor the situation carefully to prevent similar encounters with future research teams or other human activity in the area. The investigation into the circumstances that led to the crisis revealed multiple contributing factors, including unusual polar bear activity patterns in the region, food storage and preparation procedures that may have attracted the animal's attention, and emergency response procedures that had not fully accounted for the persistence and intelligence of large polar bears. The lessons learned from the crisis would inform future safety planning for Arctic research operations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's medical evaluation of team members revealed that while no one had suffered serious physical injuries, all team members showed signs of psychological trauma that would require ongoing treatment and support. The combination of isolation, immediate physical danger, and helplessness in the face of a powerful predator had created stress responses that could have long-lasting effects on mental health and future ability to work in remote locations. The media coverage of the polar bear attack brought attention to the increasing frequency of human polar bear encounters in the Arctic region, highlighting the effects of climate change on polar bear behavior and the challenges facing researchers working in changing Arctic environments. The crisis demonstrated the need for enhanced safety procedures and equipment for research operations in areas where polar bear activity was increasing. Rachel's recovery process included both medical treatment for minor exposure injuries and psychological counseling to address the trauma of the polar bear encounter. The experience had fundamentally changed her relationship with Arctic research, introducing an awareness of personal vulnerability that had not been present in her previous work. However, she remained committed to continuing her research career and contributing to the understanding of Arctic ecosystems that were changing rapidly due to climate effects. The long-term implications of the crisis extended beyond the immediate impact on the research team, to include broader questions about the safety and viability of Arctic research operations in regions where polar bear activity was increasing. The successful breach of research station defenses by a determined polar bear demonstrated that existing safety assumptions and procedures might not be adequate for future conditions in the changing Arctic environment. The scientific value of the observations made during the crisis provided important insights into polar bear behavior, intelligence, and adaptability that could inform both wildlife management and safety planning for human activity in polar bear habitat. The detailed documentation of the bear's systematic investigation techniques, problem-solving abilities, and persistence in the face of deterrent efforts offered unprecedented insights into the cognitive capabilities of these apex predators. Thomas Kowalski's footage and observations from the crisis became part of a comprehensive study of polar bear behavior that was used to develop improved safety protocols for Arctic research operations. His documentation showed the progression from curiosity to territorial behavior to aggressive investigation, providing a timeline that could help researchers understand the warning signs and critical decision points in polar bear encounters. The reconstruction of events leading to the crisis revealed that the bear had likely been in the area for several days before the direct encounter, gradually investigating the station and becoming familiar with the human activity patterns. This reconnaissance behavior suggested a level of patience and planning that had not been previously documented in polar bear studies, indicating intelligence capabilities that exceeded previous scientific understanding. The damage assessment of the research station revealed that the bear had caused significant structural damage to both the storage building and laboratory building, requiring complete reconstruction of the storage facility and major repairs to the laboratory structure. The cost of repairs and the loss of equipment and supplies exceeded $2 million, representing a substantial setback for the research program. The Wildlife Authority's investigation concluded that the bear involved in the attack was an exceptionally large and experienced male that had likely had previous encounters with human settlements and had learned to associate them with food opportunities. The animal's size, estimated at over 1,400 pounds, and its confident behavior around humans suggested an individual that posed an ongoing threat to human safety in the region. The regulatory review following the crisis led to enhanced safety requirements for Arctic research operations, including mandatory polar bear deterrent training for all personnel, improved building design standards for facilities in polar bear habitat, and enhanced communication requirements for research teams working in remote locations. These changes were designed to prevent similar crises while maintaining the ability to conduct essential Arctic research. Dr. Sarah Montgomery's analysis of the bear's behavior patterns during the crisis provided insights that were incorporated into wildlife management strategies for the region. Her observations of the animal's systematic investigation techniques and territorial behavior helped wildlife authorities develop more effective deterrent strategies and public safety procedures for areas where human polar bear encounters were likely to occur. The psychological impact study conducted with the research team members revealed common patterns of trauma response that informed the development of enhanced psychological support services for personnel working in extreme environments. The study found that the combination of isolation, immediate physical threat, and extended duration of danger created stress responses that required specialized treatment approaches. James Murphy's experience as the youngest and least experienced team member provided particular insights into the psychological preparation needed for Arctic research work. His difficulty in managing anxiety during the crisis highlighted the importance of comprehensive pre-deployment psychological screening and preparation for personnel who would be working in potentially dangerous remote locations. The emergency response analysis revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the procedures and equipment available for managing wildlife encounters in Arctic research settings. While the emergency beacon system and communication protocols functioned effectively, the deterrent devices and building security measures proved inadequate against a determined polar bear attack, leading to recommendations for enhanced defensive equipment and procedures. The rescue operation itself became a case study in complex emergency response coordination, demonstrating the challenges of conducting rescue operations in extreme weather conditions while managing dangerous wildlife encounters. The successful evacuation of all team members without additional injuries was attributed to careful planning, experienced personnel, and favorable changes in weather conditions that allowed helicopter operations. The research continuity planning following the crisis required the development of alternative methods for continuing the Arctic marine ecosystem studies that had been interrupted by the polar bear attack. Temporary facilities were established at a location with lower polar bear activity levels, though the research program faced significant delays and additional costs associated with the relocation and equipment replacement. Dr. Rachel Stein's long-term recovery included both physical rehabilitation for minor injuries sustained during the crisis and extensive psychological counseling to address the trauma of the polar bear encounter. Her experience became part of training programs for Arctic researchers, providing first-hand insights into the psychological challenges of facing large predators in remote locations. The insurance investigation of the incident revealed gaps in coverage for wildlife-related damage to research facilities, leading to changes in insurance requirements and coverage options for Arctic research operations. The substantial financial losses associated with the crisis highlighted the need for comprehensive risk management planning that accounted for the increasing frequency of human-wildlife encounters in changing Arctic environments. The scientific publications resulting from the crisis provided valuable contributions to the understanding of polar bear behavior, Arctic wildlife management, and safety procedures for research operations in extreme environments. The detailed documentation of the encounter became part of the scientific literature on human polar bear interactions and informed future research and safety planning efforts. The anniversary of the December 3rd polar bear attack at the Beaufort Sea Research Station became a significant date in Arctic research safety training, marking a turning point in the understanding of polar bear threats to human activity in the changing Arctic environment. The lessons learned from the crisis continued to influence safety procedures and equipment design for research operations in polar bear habitat. The ongoing monitoring of polar bear activity in the region following the crisis revealed increased frequency of encounters between bears and human installations, supporting the conclusion that climate change was forcing adaptations in polar bear behavior that brought them into greater conflict with human activity. The research station attack was part of a broader pattern of increasing human polar bear encounters across the Arctic region. The legacy of the December 3rd crisis extended beyond immediate safety improvements to include fundamental changes in how Arctic research operations approached wildlife risk assessment and management. The demonstration that existing safety assumptions were inadequate for dealing with intelligent, experienced, and persistent polar bears led to a comprehensive reassessment of safety procedures across the Arctic research community. The survival story of the 8 researchers who faced a massive polar bear attack during an Arctic storm became a testament to the importance of preparation, teamwork, and scientific training in extreme survival situations. While the crisis had ended successfully with all team members evacuated safely, the psychological and professional impacts continued to influence their lives and careers for years afterward. The December 3rd, 2025 polar bear attack at the Beaufort Sea Research Station remained one of the most documented and analyzed wildlife encounters in Arctic research history, providing insights that continued to inform safety procedures, wildlife management strategies, and emergency response planning for operations in one of the world's most challenging and rapidly changing environments. The courage and professionalism displayed by Dr. Rachel Stein, Dr. Michael Harrison, Dr. Jennifer Chen, Dr. Thomas Kowalski, Dr. Sarah Montgomery, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, David Kim, and James Murphy during their 18-hour ordeal became a model for crisis response in extreme conditions, demonstrating that scientific training and careful preparation could enable survival even in the face of one of nature's most formidable predators. The next stories, Kodiak. The February wind carried the scent of death across Denali's frozen wilderness, though Michael and Jessica Turner wouldn't recognize that metallic tang in the air for what it truly was. Not yet. At 2:47 p.m. on February 19th, 2025, they were still alive, still laughing, still believing that their honeymoon adventure would end with nothing more dangerous than frostbitten toes and Instagram photos that would make their friends back in Portland jealous. Michael James Turner, 28 years old, software engineer, Eagle Scout, weekend warrior with a pristine REI membership and exactly 47 wilderness camping nights under his belt, adjusted the straps of his $400 Osprey backpack for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His breath formed crystalline clouds in the -15-degree air as he studied the trail map with the methodical precision that had made him successful in debugging code, but would prove utterly inadequate for surviving what was already watching them from the dense spruce forest 200 yards to their north. "Babe, we're burning daylight," Jessica called out, her voice carrying the slight edge of impatience that had become more frequent since they'd crossed into Alaska 3 days earlier. Jessica Marie Turner, née Richardson, 26 years old, marketing director for a sustainable fashion startup, yoga instructor on weekends, had never spent a night in temperatures below freezing before this trip. The romantic notion of a winter wilderness honeymoon had seemed adventurous and Instagram-worthy when they'd planned it from the warmth of their Pearl District apartment 6 months earlier. Now, with ice crystals forming on her eyelashes and her expensive winter boots already failing to keep her feet warm, the reality felt more like an endurance test than a romantic getaway. The bear had been following them since 11:30 a.m. Neither Michael nor Jessica was aware of this fact, though the signs were there for anyone trained to recognize them. The sudden silence of the usual winter birds when they'd stopped for lunch at mile marker 23.7 along the Tokositna River Trail. The way their camp coffee had attracted no insects, despite the unseasonable warmth that had pushed temperatures up to a balmy 8 degrees above zero. The parallel depression in the snow, roughly 18 inches wide, that had appeared alongside their own tracks for the past half-mile before disappearing into the timber. The bear was a female Kodiak, though technically she was an Alaskan brown bear, since true Kodiak bears were found only on the Kodiak archipelago. This distinction would matter to the wildlife biologists who would later examine her remains, but to Michael and Jessica, she was simply 863 pounds of apex predator with a cubs-first attitude and a winter hunger that had driven her from her usual territory near Wonder Lake. Her name, if bears could be said to have names, was known to the rangers as B347, the number corresponding to the tag that had been placed in her ear during a routine tagging operation 3 summers earlier. She was 19 years old, which made her elderly by brown bear standards, and she had given birth to 3 cubs the previous spring. 2 had survived to their current 8-month age, and they waited now in a daybed she'd scraped out beneath a massive fallen spruce, approximately 3/4 of a mile behind her current position. B347 had not eaten a substantial meal in 6 days. According to the GPS, we should reach the Wonder Lake backcountry campsite by 5:30 if we maintain our current pace, Michael announced, consulting the Garmin device clipped to his jacket with the same confidence he brought to sprint planning meetings at his tech company. The device showed their current location as 63.7275 degrees north, 150.8925 degrees west, elevation 2,847 feet, approximately 14 miles from the Park Road and what passed for civilization in this part of Alaska. What the GPS couldn't show was that the Wonder Lake campsite had been closed since February 10th due to unusual bear activity in the area, a fact that would have been communicated to them if they had checked in with the ranger station at the park entrance, instead of using their backcountry permit to access the park through the lesser-known Stampede Trail entrance. The decision to take the alternative route had been Michael's, driven by his desire to avoid crowds and capture more dramatic photographs without other hikers visible in the frame. The trail they were following, officially designated as the Tokositna River Winter Route, was rated as most difficult and recommended only for experienced winter backcountry travelers with extensive cold weather survival training. Michael had interpreted his weekend camping trips to the Oregon Cascades as sufficient preparation, a miscalculation that would prove fatal within the next 14 hours and 37 minutes. B347 moved through the forest with the fluid silence that only comes from 19 years of surviving Alaskan winters. Her massive paws, each roughly the size of a dinner plate, distributed her weight across the snow so efficiently that she left barely perceptible tracks, despite weighing more than both humans combined. Her thick winter coat, a rich brown with silver-tipped guard hairs, provided such effective insulation that she generated almost no heat signature, a fact that would later complicate the thermal imaging search efforts. She had initially been attracted to the couple by the smell of their breakfast. Michael had prepared freeze-dried scrambled eggs with bacon bits, and the artificial flavoring chemicals had carried on the wind for miles in the still morning air. Bears' olfactory capabilities are roughly 7 times more sensitive than bloodhounds, and to B347, the scent was as obvious as a neon sign would be to a human. But it wasn't hunger alone that drove her interest in the 2 humans making their way along the trail. February was mating season, and the presence of her cubs meant that her protective instincts were heightened to their maximum level. While Michael and Jessica posed no actual threat to cubs that were nearly a mile away, B347's brain, operating on genetic programming refined over thousands of years of evolution, interpreted any intrusion into her expanded territory as a potential danger. At 3:15 p.m., Jessica Turner made the decision that would seal both their fates. "I need to pee," she announced, stopping abruptly and causing Michael to bump into her from behind. "And not just a little bit. I need to, properly pee." "Can you wait until we get to camp?" Michael asked, though he was already scanning the area for a suitable spot. His wilderness training had emphasized the importance of maintaining group cohesion and minimizing stops in dangerous terrain, but he could see from Jessica's expression that waiting wasn't really an option. "Michael, I've been holding it for an hour. I'm not going to make it another 2 hours." She was already unclipping her pack's waist belt, her hands clumsy in the thick winter gloves that made fine motor control nearly impossible. The spot she chose was approximately 50 feet off the main trail, behind a cluster of young spruce trees that provided visual privacy but little actual concealment. The snow was deeper here, nearly knee-deep, and she struggled to maintain her balance while removing the multiple layers necessary to answer nature's call in sub-zero temperatures. What Jessica didn't know, couldn't have known, was that she had chosen to relieve herself directly downwind of B347's current position. The bear, now only about 60 yards away and using the thick forest cover to remain invisible, suddenly found herself overwhelmed by the scent of human urine, a smell that triggered an immediate and violent territorial response. Bears, particularly female bears with cubs, interpret human scent marking as an aggressive territorial challenge. In B347's mind, this human was claiming her territory, marking it with scent in direct defiance of her presence. The response was as automatic as breathing: eliminate the threat. Michael stood guard on the trail, his back turned to provide privacy, completely unaware that his wife was now being stalked by nearly half a ton of predator whose maternal instincts had just shifted into overdrive. He was thinking about the photographs he wanted to take at Wonder Lake, planning compositions and considering whether the sunset light would be worth setting up his tripod in the brutal cold. At 3:18 p.m., Jessica finished and began the awkward process of reassembling her winter layers. The cold had made her clumsy, and she dropped her insulated pants twice before managing to pull them up over her base layers. She was focused entirely on the complex choreography of winter clothing, her attention divided between maintaining modesty and avoiding getting snow in places where snow definitely shouldn't go. B347 began her approach. The bear's movement was methodical and purposeful, each step calculated to maintain silence while closing the distance. She moved in a wide arc, using the terrain to mask her approach, staying downwind to prevent the humans from catching her scent. Her approach was a masterpiece of predatory behavior, refined through nearly 2 decades of successful hunting. At 60 yards, B347 paused behind a massive spruce trunk, easily 3 feet in diameter, and assessed her targets. The female human was isolated and vulnerable, separated from the male by both distance and the visual barrier of the trees. The male was stationary, facing away, completely unaware of any danger. Perfect conditions for an attack. At 40 yards, the bear began to move more quickly, though still maintaining her silence. Her heart rate elevated from its resting rate of approximately 40 beats per minute to nearly 90, flooding her system with adrenaline and sharpening her already acute senses to razor-edge intensity. At 25 yards, Jessica finished dressing and turned back toward the trail. For one brief moment, she looked directly at B347's position. But the bear's coloring and stillness rendered her effectively invisible against the forest backdrop. Jessica saw nothing more threatening than shadows and tree trunks. "I'm ready," Jessica called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. The sound provided B347 with an exact location fix on her target. At 15 yards, Michael began walking back toward Jessica's position, following her tracks in the snow. "How are you feeling? Need to rest a bit before we push onto camp?" "No, I'm good. Actually, I feel a lot better. Amazing what a good pee can do for your mood." Jessica's laugh was light, relaxed, completely free of any sense of impending danger. At 10 yards, B347 broke into a charge. The initial sound was like thunder rolling across the landscape. The deep, explosive grunt that brown bears make when launching an attack, followed immediately by the crashing percussion of her massive body smashing through the underbrush. 800 pounds of muscle and bone and claw accelerated from standstill to 25 miles per hour in under 3 seconds, closing the final 10 yards before Jessica could even register what was happening. Michael heard the sound first, that primal roar that triggered every ancestral fear encoded in human DNA. He spun around, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing, a massive dark shape exploding out of the forest directly toward Jessica, who stood frozen in the deep snow like a statue, her mouth open in shock, but no sound emerging. "Jessica!" Michael's scream ripped through the winter air, but it was far too late for warnings or evasive action. B347 struck Jessica at full speed, her massive front paws connecting with the woman's torso with the force of a small car accident. The impact lifted Jessica completely off her feet and sent her flying backwards into a spruce tree, the sharp crack of breaking ribs audible even over the bear's continued roaring. Jessica's world exploded into pain and confusion. One moment she had been standing in peaceful snow-covered forest, thinking about how much she was looking forward to a hot cup of cocoa when they reached camp. The next moment she was airborne, her body spinning helplessly through space with no understanding of what had caused this sudden transition from safety to catastrophe. She hit the tree trunk at roughly 15 miles per hour, her spine compressing against the unforgiving bark with enough force to fracture 2 vertebrae and drive splinters of wood through her expensive winter jacket. She collapsed into the snow beneath the tree, her legs refusing to respond to commands from her brain, warm blood beginning to pool beneath her back where the broken ribs had punctured her lung. Michael's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. Eagle Scout Wilderness Survival Protocol: make noise, appear large, back away slowly, avoid direct eye contact. He raised his arms over his head, making himself appear as tall as possible, and began backing toward Jessica while shouting at the top of his lungs, "Hey, bear! Get back! Go away!" His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being in control of situations, someone whose analytical mind was trying to apply logical solutions to a fundamentally illogical situation. B347 turned toward the male human with the same explosive speed she had demonstrated in her initial attack. Her assessment was instantaneous. This was the mate of the female she had just neutralized, and he represented a continued threat to her territory and cubs. The fact that her cubs were nearly a mile away was irrelevant. Maternal programming doesn't operate on precise geographical logic. Michael had perhaps 2 seconds to register the bear's attention, shifting to him, before she launched her second charge. In those 2 seconds, he experienced a moment of perfect clarity about his situation. He was 14 miles from the nearest road, armed with nothing more dangerous than a folding camping knife, facing a predator that could run twice as fast as any human and possessed the strength to decapitate a moose with a single swipe. He ran. Every piece of wilderness survival advice he'd ever read specifically warned against running from bears. But when 800 pounds of apex predator is accelerating toward you with obvious intent to kill, evolutionary programming overrides intellectual knowledge. Michael's legs were pumping before his brain had consciously decided to flee, his body following genetic imperatives that predated human civilization by millions of years. He made it approximately 40 feet before B347 caught him. The bear's massive front paw struck him between the shoulder blades with enough force to snap his forward momentum and send him sprawling face first into the snow. He rolled as he fell, his camping and climbing experience providing enough muscle memory to turn a potentially fatal faceplant into a controlled tumble, and came up facing the bear with his arms again raised in the classic defensive posture. "Get back!" he shouted again, though his voice cracked with the strain and fear. "I'm not a threat! Leave us alone!" B347 reared up on her hind legs, rising to her full height of nearly 9 feet, her massive form blocking out the weak February sun. From Michael's position on the ground, she looked like a mountain of fur and muscle, her small dark eyes fixed on his face with unmistakable intent. Her mouth hung open, revealing teeth designed for crushing bone and tearing flesh, each canine roughly the size of Michael's thumb. For one impossible moment, they stared at each other across a distance of perhaps 6 feet. Human intelligence and 28 years of civilized life meeting raw predatory instinct refined by 19 years of surviving in one of the planet's most unforgiving environments. Michael found himself thinking, with the bizarre clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme terror, that she was actually beautiful in a terrible way, her silver-tipped fur catching the light like some kind of mythical creature. Then she dropped back to all fours and lunged. Michael threw himself to the side, rolling desperately through the snow, but B347 was too quick and too experienced. Her claws, each roughly 4 inches long and harder than steel, raked across his back, shredding through his winter jacket and the layers beneath as though they were tissue paper. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Not just the sharp agony of torn flesh, but the deeper, more frightening sensation of damage to structures that weren't supposed to be damaged. He kept rolling, driven by pure survival instinct, until he fetched up against a fallen log that had been invisible under the snow. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and left him gasping in the frigid air, each inhalation sending razor blades of cold deep into his chest. B347 followed his movement with predatory patience, no longer charging but stalking, her massive form moving in a wide circle around his position. Her breathing was steady and controlled despite the exertion of the chase. She was operating well within her physical capabilities, while Michael was already approaching exhaustion. "Jessica," Michael called out, though he didn't dare take his eyes off the bear to check on his wife's condition. "Jessica, can you hear me?" There was no response from the base of the spruce tree where she had landed. Whether this was because she was unconscious, unable to speak, or worse, Michael couldn't tell. The silence was somehow more terrifying than any scream would have been. B347 completed her circle and positioned herself between Michael and the trail, effectively cutting off any possibility of escape. Her tactics demonstrated the intelligence that made brown bears such successful predators. She had isolated her targets from any help, neutralized the female, and now had the male trapped in terrain that favored her strengths while negating his few advantages. Michael's mind raced through his options. His satellite GPS device had an emergency beacon, but it was in his pack, which he had dropped when he first started running. The pack was now somewhere between his current position and the trail, close enough to see, but impossibly far away, with 800 pounds of predator blocking the path. His cell phone was useless. They had been out of coverage range since early morning. His camping knife was clipped to his belt, but bringing out a weapon would likely provoke an immediate attack, and the 4-inch blade would be about as effective against this bear as a toothpick would be against a charging rhinoceros. The reality of his situation settled over him like a physical weight. They were going to die out here. Not might die, were going to die. The only questions were how long it would take and how much it would hurt. But accepting defeat wasn't in Michael Turner's nature. The same obsessive personality that had made him successful in debugging complex software problems began analyzing the situation with methodical precision. What did he know about bears? What were their weaknesses? How could 2 humans, even badly injured humans, tip the odds in their favor? B347 seemed to sense his mental shift from panic to calculation. She dropped into a crouch, her massive muscles coiled for another charge, her eyes never leaving his face. Bears were ambush predators by preference, but she was perfectly capable of adapting her tactics to changing circumstances. The charge, when it came, was different from her previous attacks, more controlled, more calculated. Instead of the explosive speed she had used on Jessica, B347 approached at a steady lope that allowed her to adjust her angle of attack as Michael tried to evade. Michael dove to his left, but the bear had anticipated the movement and was already adjusting her trajectory. Her massive front paw caught him across the ribs, the impact spinning him around and sending him crashing back into the snow. This time he felt something give way in his chest. Not just torn muscle and skin, but the deeper, more ominous sensation of structural damage. He tried to roll away again, but his body wasn't responding properly. The blow had done something to his coordination, and his left arm seemed to be working independently of his conscious control. When he looked down at it, he could see bone white against the red of torn flesh, and the sight triggered a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the cold. B347 stood over him, her massive form blocking out the sky, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. This close, he could smell her, not the clean, wild scent he might have expected, but something darker and more complex. Old meat and fresh blood and something else, something primitive that his hindbrain recognized, even if his conscious mind couldn't name it. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she simply looked at him. Her small, dark eyes seemed to be evaluating, calculating, deciding whether he still represented a threat worth her attention or had been sufficiently neutralized. Michael found himself holding his breath, afraid that any movement might tip her decision toward finishing what she had started. Then, from somewhere behind him, came a sound that changed everything. Jessica's voice, weak but unmistakably alive. Michael, I can't feel my legs." B347's head snapped toward the sound, her predatory focus immediately shifting from the male she had disabled to the female who had just revealed that she was still conscious. In the bear's perception, a wounded prey animal was attempting to communicate with its mate, possibly coordinating an escape attempt or calling for help. This could not be permitted. Michael saw the shift in the bear's attention and understood immediately what was about to happen. "No!" he screamed, pushing himself up from the snow despite the agony in his chest and arm. "Leave her alone!" He stumbled toward B347, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but driven by desperate love and determination. If the bear was going to kill Jessica, she would have to go through him first. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one he had. B347 turned back toward him with something that might have been annoyance. She had already dealt with this threat once, and his continued interference was preventing her from completing her territorial defense. Her massive paw swept out almost casually, catching Michael across the face and sending him spinning back into the snow. The blow opened up his scalp from his hairline to his left ear, and blood began flowing freely down his face, the warm liquid feeling strangely pleasant against his cold skin. His vision doubled, then tripled, then gradually resolved into something approximating normal sight. When he could see clearly again, B347 was no longer standing over him. She had moved toward Jessica's position at the base of the spruce tree, her gait purposeful and unhurried. She knew her prey was trapped and injured. There was no need for haste. "Jessica!" Michael called out, his voice slurred by the blow to his head. "Jess, you need to move. You need to get up." "I can't." Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the still winter air it carried clearly. "Michael, I think my back is broken. I can't feel anything below my waist." B347 reached Jessica's position and stood looking down at the injured woman. Jessica, lying on her side in the blood-stained snow, looked up at 800 pounds of predator and felt something beyond fear settle over her. This was how she was going to die, torn apart by a wild animal in a frozen wasteland, 14 miles from the nearest human help. Her honeymoon turned into a nightmare that would traumatize her husband for the rest of his life, if he lived long enough to be traumatized. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether she was apologizing to Michael or to the bear or to herself wasn't clear. "I'm so sorry." B-347 lowered her massive head toward Jessica's prone form, and for one impossible moment, the woman thought the bear might be showing some kind of mercy, some recognition of shared mammalian kinship that would stay her attack. Instead, B-347's jaws opened to their full extent, wide enough to encompass a human head with room to spare, and closed around Jessica's shoulder and upper chest. The scream that tore from Jessica's throat was unlike any sound Michael had ever heard a human being make. It was primal and raw and completely without hope, the sound of someone experiencing pain beyond the capacity of the human nervous system to process. It went on for nearly 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the bear's breathing and the wet, tearing noises of feeding. Michael struggled to his feet, his vision swimming and his coordination shot, but driven by a rage that overwhelmed his fear. His wife was dying 20 feet away from him, and he was going to reach her or die trying. The camping knife was in his hand, though he couldn't remember drawing it, and he stumbled toward the bear with murder in his heart. B-347 looked up from her feeding, Jessica's blood staining her muzzle and chest, and regarded the approaching male with what might have been surprise. Most prey animals, once disabled, accepted their fate and died quietly. This one's continued resistance was unusual, perhaps even impressive. Michael reached the bear and drove his 4-inch knife blade deep into her shoulder, just behind her front leg, where he hoped to find something vital. The blade penetrated roughly 3 inches before hitting bone and stopping, barely a pinprick to an animal of B-347's size and constitution. B-347's response was immediate and overwhelming. Her massive paw swept around in a backhanded blow that caught Michael in the ribs and lifted him completely off his feet. He flew backwards through the air, his trajectory carrying him over Jessica's motionless form and into the base of another tree, where he hit with a wet, crunching sound that seemed to echo through the forest. When he tried to breathe, nothing happened. His diaphragm contracted, his chest attempted to expand, but no air entered his lungs. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but the oxygen wasn't coming, and panic began to override the pain as his vision started to narrow toward tunnel vision. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds, his breathing reflex finally kicked in, and he gasped in a lungful of frigid air that sent him into a coughing fit that brought up blood. Several of his ribs were definitely broken, and at least one had probably punctured his lung, but he was alive and conscious and still capable of movement. B-347 had returned her attention to Jessica, who was no longer moving or making any sound. The bear's feeding was methodical and efficient, her powerful jaws and carnassial teeth designed for exactly this type of consumption. She would feed for perhaps 10 minutes, then move on to deal with the male if he continued to present a threat. Michael forced himself into a sitting position, his back against the tree trunk, and took stock of his situation. His left arm was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places. Several ribs were cracked or broken. His scalp wound was still bleeding freely, and he was beginning to feel the early symptoms of hypothermia. The shivering had stopped, which was a bad sign. But he was alive, and Jessica might still be alive, and as long as both of those things remained true, he wasn't giving up. The satellite GPS with its emergency beacon was still in his pack, somewhere between his current position and the trail. If he could reach it, if he could activate the beacon, search and rescue teams might be able to locate them within hours instead of days. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was the only chance they had. Moving as quietly as possible, Michael began to crawl away from the feeding bear, heading in the direction where he thought his pack might have fallen. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his chest and arm, but he forced himself to keep going, using his good arm and his legs to propel himself across the blood-stained snow. B347, focused on her meal, didn't notice the male's movement until he was nearly 15 feet away from her position. When she did look up, her dark eyes tracked his progress with the patient attention of a predator who knows her prey can't escape. Let the wounded animal crawl away. She would deal with him when she was ready. Michael's pack was closer than he had hoped, only about 30 feet from the tree where he had taken shelter. But 30 feet might as well have been 30 miles when every movement felt like someone was driving spikes into his chest. He forced himself to keep crawling, focused entirely on the orange fabric of his pack that stood out against the white snow like a beacon of hope. Behind him, the sounds of feeding continued, wet and rhythmic and horrible. Michael tried not to think about what those sounds meant, tried not to picture what was happening to the woman he had married just 10 days earlier. Instead, he focused on the mechanical process of movement: right arm forward, pull, left leg forward, push, repeat. When he finally reached his pack, his hands were shaking so badly from cold and shock that he could barely operate the zippers. The main compartment held their food and camping gear, but the GPS was in the smaller top pocket, designed for quick access to navigation equipment. His fingers, nearly numb despite his insulated gloves, fumbled with the zipper pull. It seemed to take forever to work the zipper open, and when he finally managed to get his hand into the pocket, he couldn't feel the GPS device through his gloves. He pulled off his right glove with his teeth, exposing his hand to the sub-zero air, and immediately felt the GPS's familiar rectangular shape. The device was cold enough to burn his skin, but it powered on when he pressed the button, its screen glowing like a miracle in the dim winter light. The emergency beacon function was buried in the GPS's menu system, and Michael's vision was swimming too badly for him to read the small text on the screen. He cycled through the menus by memory, praying that he was selecting the right options, until he found what he was looking for: emergency beacon, activate yes, no. He selected yes and pressed the confirmation button. The device's screen changed to show beacon activated, signal transmitting, help is on the way. Michael stared at the words for a long moment, hardly daring to believe that help might actually be coming. The beacon would transmit their exact GPS coordinates to the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center, which would dispatch search and rescue teams to their location. But would help arrive in time? The feeding sounds behind him had stopped, which could mean either that B347 had finished with Jessica, or that she had noticed his absence and was preparing to address his continued existence as a potential threat. Michael turned slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger another attack. B347 was standing over Jessica's motionless form, her massive head turned in Michael's direction. Her muzzle and chest were stained with blood, and her dark eyes held the patient, calculating expression of a predator, deciding whether additional effort was required to secure her territory. Jessica was no longer recognizable as the woman he had married. The bear's attack had been efficient and thorough, designed to eliminate threats rather than to provide a prolonged meal. Michael felt his sanity threatening to fracture as he looked at what remained of his wife, but he forced himself to focus on survival. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford until rescue arrived. B347 began walking toward his position, her gait unhurried, but purposeful. She had neutralized one threat and was now prepared to deal with the second. The fact that the male had managed to crawl away and access some kind of equipment suggested that he might still be capable of calling for help, which made him a priority target. Michael clutched the GPS device against his chest and tried to think of anything that might improve his chances of surviving the next few minutes. The knife had proven useless against the bear's thick hide and massive bone structure. He had no other weapons, no shelter, no way to make himself appear more threatening than he actually was. But bears were intelligent animals, capable of learning and adapting their behavior based on experience. B347 had already determined that the humans represented some kind of territorial threat. But if Michael could convince her that the threat had been eliminated, she might choose to withdraw rather than waste additional energy on unnecessary killing. Playing dead was a classic bear encounter strategy, though it was generally recommended for defensive encounters with surprise bears rather than predatory encounters like this one. But given his injuries and the impossibility of escape, it might be his only option. Michael lay down in the snow, curling into a fetal position with his hands clasped behind his neck to protect his vital organs. He forced himself to breathe slowly and shallowly, trying to project the image of a defeated, non-threatening animal that posed no further danger to the bear's territory or cubs. B347 approached cautiously, clearly suspicious of this sudden change in behavior. She had expected the male to continue his aggressive resistance, and his sudden submission was puzzling. She stopped about 6 feet away from his prone form and studied him carefully, looking for signs of deception or continued threat. Michael held perfectly still, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run or fight or do anything other than lie helpless in the snow while a massive predator decided his fate. He could hear B347's breathing, could smell her musk and the metallic scent of blood, could sense her massive presence looming over him like a mountain of death. Minutes passed. Michael's injured lung made shallow breathing difficult, and his broken ribs sent fresh spikes of pain through his chest with each inhalation. The cold was seeping through his torn jacket and into his core, and he could feel his body temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. If the bear didn't kill him, hypothermia would finish the job within hours. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard B347's footsteps moving away from his position. He risked opening one eye, just enough to see her massive form retreating toward the forest, her territorial defense apparently complete. She had eliminated the threats to her cubs and marked the area with scent and violence. Her work here was done. Michael waited until the sound of her movement had faded completely before allowing himself to move. When he finally sat up, the forest around him was silent except for the whisper of wind through the spruce trees and the distant crack of settling snow. Jessica was gone. Not just dead. Gone, in the most fundamental sense of the word. The vibrant, laughing woman who had shared his bed and his dreams and his vision of their future together had been reduced to scattered remains in the blood-stained snow. The enormity of the loss hit him like a physical blow, and he doubled over with grief that felt like drowning. But he was alive, and the GPS beacon was still transmitting, and somewhere in Alaska's vast emergency response network, people were already mobilizing to come find him. He had to stay alive long enough for them to arrive. The first priority was shelter. His core body temperature was dropping rapidly, and exposure would kill him just as efficiently as the bear had killed Jessica. His tent was in his pack, along with his sleeping bag and emergency supplies, but setting up a proper shelter would require more energy and coordination than he could currently manage. Instead, he focused on immediate survival. His emergency space blanket was in the outside pocket of his pack, designed for exactly this kind of situation. The reflective material would help retain his body heat and make him more visible to search aircraft. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and tried to find a position that minimized his exposure to the wind. The GPS device showed that his beacon was still transmitting, updating every few minutes to confirm that the signal was reaching the satellite network. According to the display, help had been notified and was en route, but it provided no estimate of arrival time. In Alaska's vast wilderness, search and rescue operations could take hours or even days, depending on weather conditions and the availability of aircraft. Michael settled in to wait, his back against a tree trunk, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of B347's return. The bear had withdrawn for now, but she might change her mind if she detected continued signs of human activity in her territory. Every sound, every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the trees could signal her return. As the afternoon wore on and the weak winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon, Michael found himself drifting in and out of consciousness. His injuries, combined with blood loss and hypothermia, were taking their toll on his body's ability to maintain normal function. Several times he caught himself nodding off, only to jerk awake with the panicked realization that unconsciousness might be permanent. At 4:47 p.m., he heard the distant sound of aircraft engines. The sound was faint at first, easily mistaken for wind or the settling of snow-laden trees, but it grew steadily louder and more distinct. Michael forced himself to his feet, ignoring the fresh wave of pain from his broken ribs, and began waving the GPS device over his head like a signal flag. The device's screen was bright enough to be visible from the air, and its emergency beacon would be broadcasting their exact coordinates to the search aircraft. The helicopter, he could see now that it was a helicopter, probably a military search and rescue bird, appeared over the tree line about half a mile to the south. It was flying a grid search pattern, methodically covering the area around the coordinates provided by Michael's beacon. The aircraft was painted in the distinctive orange and white colors of the U.S. Coast Guard, and Michael felt a surge of hope that nearly brought him to his knees. He continued waving the GPS device, and after what seemed like forever, the helicopter's flight pattern changed to a direct approach toward his position. The pilot had spotted him, either visually or through the aircraft's direction-finding equipment. Help was finally arriving. The helicopter circled his position once, the crew undoubtedly assessing the situation and looking for a suitable landing zone. The forest was too dense for a direct landing, but there was a small clearing about 100 yards away that might be large enough for the aircraft to set down safely. As the helicopter moved toward the clearing, Michael began the painful process of gathering his essential gear. The GPS device was obviously critical, but he also wanted to retrieve what remained of Jessica's personal effects, her wedding ring, if it could be found, and perhaps some other small items that could be returned to her family. But when he reached the site of the attack, he found that there was very little left to recover. B-347's feeding had been thorough, and what remained was scattered across a wide area that would require professional forensic examination to properly process. Michael's trained engineer's mind tried to catalogue what he was seeing, but his emotional brain simply shut down, refusing to process the reality of what had happened to the woman he loved. He settled for retrieving Jessica's backpack, which had been thrown clear during the initial attack and remained largely intact. Inside, he found her camera, her wallet, her wedding ring. She had removed it during the bathroom break to avoid losing it in the snow, a practical precaution that had inadvertently preserved it. These small personal items somehow seemed more precious than any amount of gold or jewels. The helicopter had landed in the clearing and was disgorging a team of paramedics and rescue personnel. Michael could see them making their way toward his position, moving quickly but carefully through the forest. Their bright orange gear made them easy to track against the white snow, and their professional competence was obvious even at a distance. Within minutes, the first paramedic reached his position, a compact woman in her 30s whose name tag read Martinez. She took one look at Michael's condition and immediately began the rapid assessment that would determine his treatment priorities. "Sir, I'm Paramedic Martinez with the Alaska Air National Guard. We're here to get you out of here. Can you tell me your name?" "Michael Turner," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. My wife Jessica. We know, sir. We've located her remains. I'm very sorry for your loss, but right now I need to focus on getting you stabilized for transport. Can you tell me where you're injured?" The next few minutes passed in a blur of professional medical activity. Martinez and her partner, a tall man named Rodriguez, worked with practiced efficiency to assess Michael's injuries, establish IV access, and prepare him for helicopter evacuation. Their movements were quick and competent, and their presence filled Michael with a sense of safety that he hadn't felt since the morning when he and Jessica had broken camp at their previous site. "We've got multiple rib fractures, possible pneumothorax, compound fracture of the left ulna, significant scalp lacerations, and probable hypothermia," Martinez reported into her radio as they loaded Michael onto a portable stretcher. "Patient is conscious and coherent, but showing signs of shock. We're going to need a trauma team standing by at Alaska Regional." The helicopter ride to Anchorage was a 30-minute journey that seemed to last both forever and no time at all. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness, the combination of pain medication and exhaustion finally overwhelming his determination to stay alert. The last thing he remembered before succumbing to the drugs was looking out the helicopter's window and seeing the vast expanse of Alaska's wilderness stretching to the horizon in every direction, beautiful, terrible, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. He woke up in Alaska Regional Hospital's trauma unit, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of medical equipment and the quiet efficiency of hospital staff. The first face he saw belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma surgeon who had spent 4 hours repairing the damage inflicted by B-347's attack. "Mr. Turner, you're in Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage. You've been in surgery and your injuries have been stabilized. How are you feeling?" Michael tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. Dr. Chen held a cup of water to his lips, and he managed a few sips before attempting to answer. "Jessica," he whispered. "What about Jessica?" Dr. Chen's expression grew somber. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Turner. Your wife's remains were recovered by the search and rescue team, but she was already deceased when they arrived. The Alaska State Troopers will want to speak with you when you're feeling up to it, but there's no rush. Your recovery is the priority right now." The next several days passed in a medicated haze of surgery, physical therapy, and gradually increasing awareness of the magnitude of what had happened. Michael's injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. The broken ribs would heal, the fractured arm would regain full function with time and therapy, and the psychological trauma would require years of counseling, but was not insurmountable. But Jessica was gone forever, and no amount of medical intervention could bring her back. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. The story of a honeymooning couple attacked by a massive bear in Denali National Park captured the public imagination in a way that similar tragedies rarely did. Perhaps it was the romantic tragedy of newlyweds whose dream vacation had become a nightmare. Or perhaps it was the primal fear that wilderness encounters evoked in people who lived comfortable urban lives. But the story dominated news cycles for weeks. Michael found himself at the center of a media storm that he was completely unprepared to handle. Reporters called constantly, seeking interviews and exclusive details about the attack. Television producers offered substantial sums for his story rights. Publishers wanted him to write a book about his survival experience. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to profit from Jessica's death and his trauma. The Alaska State Troopers' investigation was thorough and professional. Wildlife biologist Dr. James Kowalski, who had been tracking B-347 for several years as part of a long-term bear behavior study, provided crucial insight into the attack dynamics and the bear's likely motivations. "This was a classic territorial defense response," Dr. Kowalski explained during one of several interviews with the investigators. B-347 was an older female with cubs, operating in an area she considered her home territory. The presence of humans, particularly humans, who were marking territory with scent, which is how she would have interpreted urination, triggered an automatic defensive response. The investigation concluded that Michael and Jessica had done nothing wrong and had not violated any park regulations. Their backcountry permit was valid, their equipment was appropriate for the conditions, and their planned route was within their stated experience level. The attack was simply one of those rare but inevitable encounters that occur when humans enter genuine wilderness areas. B347 was never located by wildlife management teams, despite extensive tracking efforts. The bear had disappeared into Alaska's vast wilderness, returning to her cubs and her normal behavioral patterns. DNA analysis of blood and hair samples confirmed her identity and provided additional data for ongoing bear research projects, but the bear herself remained free. Some members of the public called for the bear to be hunted down and killed, arguing that an animal that had killed a human posed an ongoing threat to park visitors. But Dr. Kowalski and other wildlife experts successfully argued that B347 had acted according to her natural instincts and that destroying her would accomplish nothing other than satisfying a human desire for revenge. "Bears don't commit murder," Dr. Kowalski wrote in an editorial published in the Anchorage Daily News. "They respond to perceived threats according to millions of years of evolutionary programming. B347 defended her territory and her cubs exactly as nature intended her to do. The tragedy here is not that a bear acted like a bear, but that two human beings were in the wrong place at the wrong time." Michael's recovery was slow and complicated by depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and survivor's guilt that made him question why he had lived when Jessica had died. He underwent multiple surgeries to repair nerve damage in his arm, spent months in physical therapy relearning basic motor skills, and worked with psychiatrists and counselors to address the psychological impact of witnessing his wife's death. The hardest part was returning to Portland and facing the life he and Jessica had built together. Their apartment still contained wedding gifts they hadn't finished opening, honeymoon plans they would never complete, and 1,000 small reminders of the future that had been torn away in less than 10 minutes of violence. Jessica's family was supportive but devastated, struggling to understand how their daughter's fairy tale wedding had led to such a horrific ending. The funeral was a media circus, with photographers and reporters vastly outnumbering genuine mourners, and Michael found himself wondering if this was how he would remember Jessica forever. Not as the vibrant, laughing woman he had married, but as the victim of a sensationalized tragedy. 6 months after the attack, Michael made the decision to leave Portland and start over somewhere else. The constant reminders of his life with Jessica were preventing him from moving forward, and the media attention showed no signs of diminishing. He sold their apartment, donated most of their shared possessions to charity, and relocated to a small town in Montana where nobody knew his story. But even in his new life, the wilderness continued to call to him in ways that he couldn't fully understand. Perhaps it was survivor's guilt, or perhaps it was a need to confront the source of his trauma, but Michael found himself drawn back to Alaska time and again. He became an advocate for wilderness safety education, speaking to groups about bear awareness and backcountry preparedness. He worked with park services to develop better warning systems for areas with high bear activity, and sometimes late at night he would dream about B347. Not nightmares of the attack, but strange, peaceful dreams in which he and the bear would look at each other across some impossible divide and find a kind of understanding. In these dreams, he would see her cubs, healthy and strong and growing into the next generation of Alaska's apex predators, and feel something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't hatred either. The bear had done what bears do. Jessica had died because she was human, and humans are fragile creatures who don't belong in certain places at certain times. The tragedy wasn't that nature was cruel. Nature was simply nature, neither cruel nor kind, but operating according to laws far older and more fundamental than human morality. Michael Turner learned to live with that truth, even if he never learned to like it. And somewhere in Alaska's vast wilderness, B347 continued her ancient cycle of survival, raising her cubs and defending her territory, unaware that she had forever changed the life of the man who had learned that love and loss were sometimes separated by nothing more than the sound of breaking branches and the thunder of an apex predator's charge. The story of Michael and Jessica Turner became part of Alaska's oral tradition, told and retold around campfires and in ranger stations, serving as both cautionary tale and reminder of the thin line that separates civilization from the wild. Their names joined the long list of those who had sought adventure in America's last frontier and found instead the ultimate price of that adventure. But for Michael, Jessica's memory became something more than tragedy. It became a reminder that love, even love that ends in devastating loss, is worth the risk of pain. He never remarried, never tried to replace what he had lost, but he learned to carry her memory as something precious rather than something that haunted him. And on quiet winter evenings in his Montana home, when the wind howled down from the mountains and snow covered the world in pristine white, Michael would sometimes remember not the horror of that February day, but the joy in Jessica's laugh when she had seen her first glimpse of Alaska's wilderness. That laugh, at least, belonged to him forever, beyond the reach of bears or time or the inevitable tragedy that waits at the end of every love story.